Hey, welcome to my first YouTube video as Fightlossophy. Since it is my first video, I wanted to go over very quickly what I envision this channel to be about. In short, I want to encourage exploration and active thinking about this beautiful genre of ours, and to rediscover many things that the genre itself has forgotten or shied away from. These videos will be more technical in nature, but I aim to be thorough in my explanation and reasonings so that everyone can follow. The opinions expressed in this video are formed from a lot of investigation and discussion with other players. The ideas themselves I will try to demonstrate using concrete examples. I hope that you will evaluate these ideas with an open mind and think on them for yourself. If this video inspires new ideas or differing opinions, then of course, I would love to see them so that we can explore them together and further FGC discourse. As for this video itself, I will show that some modern fighting game design principles, such as reducing executional requirements, pushback, and movement, lead to frame data-centric gameplay, guessing, and volatility. This video is intended for everyone. For people with little experience in the genre, I will do my best to explain things in full detail and make this fun and enjoyable to listen to. For players who have not had the chance to play classic titles, I hope to be able to demonstrate changes over time and grant you a new perspective. And for veteran players, I hope to be able to express the frustrations that we are experiencing and be able to prove these ideas in exhaustive detail, starting from an examination of the system mechanics themselves, then to their effects. First, we will be covering a short history of the general trends and design principles of fighting games. We will then dive into more detail on how modern design impacts offense, defense, and neutral. Then we will investigate the design and the consequences of these system mechanics themselves. Through these downstream effects, I aim to show how this design pattern is neither beneficial towards newcomers to the genre or particularly rewarding for more experienced players. Alright, let's get started. In order to give proper context towards modern fighting game design principles, I want to show the change of trends in fighting games by diving into the history of the genre. Fighting games, though unique as a genre in terms of ideation and community, do not necessarily exist in a vacuum. They are inherently tied to the software and computing ecosystem which they live in, as well as to other fighting games, such that trends throughout the genre can be traced along these different franchises in parallel over time. There are, of course, many evolutions that can be tracked this way, such as graphical or technical development, to the creation of lobby systems meant to emulate arcade environments, or even the importance of online netcode and online play over time. For the purposes of our video, we will specifically be investigating this history through the lens of system design and difficulty, such as through skill floors and skill ceilings. As per the fighting game glossary, skill floor is defined as the minimum amount of knowledge and practice needed to progress past basic button mashing and start getting better. It's important that there's some intentionality to these actions, since any game can be played without thought. An interesting part of this definition, of course, is the usage of the word intentionality, so be sure to remember this for very later. Secondly, skill ceiling is then defined as the absolute peak of skill possible by a human in a game, assuming basically unlimited time and knowledge. I would also like to define a term similar to skill ceiling, which I call the practical ceiling. This I call the peak of skill in a game achievable with consistency under pressure. We can think of this as pro level, and for the most part, this will be under the skill ceiling definitionally. As for the reverse, I would also like to define a concept simply called new player value, just to mark a hypothetically truly new player who has no exposure to the genre, such that basic genre conventions like moving and blocking are new to them. Now that we have these basic concepts, what we are looking at here is a skill curve, or learning curve chart. Typically meant to be a graphical representation of the theoretical relationship between proficiency and time, I will make this one a little special, where the x-axis will represent player skill experience, and y will demonstrate their effectiveness in a game. In practice, this functions similar to time as the x-axis and y as proficiency, just that time alone is not going to guarantee an individual professional level skill, but from a theoretical perspective, it's more or less the same. Over all the way on the left, we have the new player level to define the level of effectiveness that they will start at. All the way on the right will be the practical ceiling for professionals. This line represents the skill floor, or where it begins to come together, and this represents the skill ceiling. And now that we've explained those terms, this chart in particular is meant to represent the skill curve of Super Turbo, or a hypothetical curve from the beginning of the genre. Without any ease of use measures and the relative ineffectiveness of mashing, we can basically assume that the new player level starts at 0. The skill floor happens at really an arbitrary place in the middle, and the practical ceiling is all the way up here. Given Super Turbo's relative jank and still unexplored territory, the game's skill ceiling is yet still above that. In some ways, this is more or less the prototypical skill curve. So what's next? I will be analyzing the history of fighting games through trends, or general buckets of game design standards and philosophies through an admittedly Capcom-focused lens. Not that Capcom necessarily invents or starts trends, but as a well-understood and foundational series, the differences between each of these games show clear trends which other franchises also follow in parallel. Therefore, we can think of Super Turbo as being a generation, Third Strike as another, then 4, 5, and now 6, and also talk about games created around each of these benchmarks. For example, in the Street Fighter IV era, players of those games can be referred to as 09ers, and Street Fighter V players as 16ers. As for examples to be shown throughout the video, I will focus on games in Street Fighter that I am more familiar with, such as Third Strike, Street Fighter V, and Street Fighter VI as opposed to Street Fighter IV. Third Strike and Street Fighter VI are really nice comparisons anyways, as both are aggressive system-heavy games with fast dashes and an emphasis on resources and throw-based offense. Likely something that I may talk about in another video, I can think of Third Strike really as one of the first modern retro games, whereas we can take a look at Street Fighter VI as a game that was really particularly influenced by Third Strike. For the Third Strike generation, we can also include other games such as MVC2, Darkstalkers, Guilty Gear XX, KOF 2002. Interesting to note and important for this discussion is that by reputation, many of these games are explicitly discussed as some of the fighting games with the highest skill ceiling. These games pushed boundaries after the genre's foundation, creating wild new interpretations and mechanics that also pushed players. These traits led to crazy gameplay, personal expressiveness and skill, and of course, many extreme displays of skills such as Evo Moment 37. I'll be showing some examples from Third Strike later on. Side note, also within this general era of gaming as a whole is Quake, Brood War, and Vanilla Warcraft. Maybe there was something in the water. So the skill curve looks a little something like this. The new player level hasn't really changed all that much, but we can see here that the skill floor increased a little, though I will argue that Third Strike Ken is one of the easiest characters to pick up in the franchise, and that the practical ceiling is higher, but also that there is a larger gap between the practical ceiling and the general skill ceiling. Sky is the limit. After a long break, the Street Fighter series returns with Street Fighter IV, marking a new era with new players across the community, generally referred to as 09ers. In addition to Street Fighter IV, we can also count other games such as MVC3, BlazBlue, and Guilty Gear Xrd in this era. The general trend here is the sanding off of the rough edges in the previous era, while still maintaining complexity and high skill ceilings. Coincidentally, I also feel like there's a lot of OS that emerge from this era's game designs, and I also feel like there's a lot of set play. Also interesting to note is the proliferation of one-frame links in Street Fighter 4, or in short, combos where you need to link a second attack at the perfect frame, making the skill floor much higher than in Third Strike, though in general when comparing Exert to plus R or BlazBlue to plus R, the trend holds true. Remember when they were called Blaze Babies? Good times. Here we can see that the new player level is the slightest bit higher, but not too great of a difference. While the skill floor, practical ceiling, and the skill ceiling are still high, with the slightest bit of compression. And now here's where things really begin. Street Fighter V, released in 2016, marked the start of an era that you can call the simplification era. For all that I do enjoy about the game, I will do it this one favor and ignore its personal failings during its rough start, and treat it as the finished product in Championship Edition. Even better if I could talk about Season 5 before a certain someone. Around this time, we have a lot of other games, such as Strive, Grand Blue Fantasy Versus, MVCI, BB Tag, Dragon Ball FighterZ, DNF Duel. ArcSys has been really hard at work when we look at it that way. We are also introduced to new trends in the community and the companies towards simplifying games to allow for new players to join, or that new players want to get to the real heart of the game, that is the reads and the mind games, without wasting time on execution. Later in this video, I will be discussing how lowering execution barriers drastically reduces the depth to these very mind games, while also increasing the textbook knowledge needed, like frame data. As for some of the mechanical decisions and general philosophies that have proliferated through this era in terms of difficulty, for instance, we have very generous input buffers. Street Fighter IV's one-frame links are a result of it lacking an input buffer, but by comparison, Street Fighter VI with a 4-frame input buffer, for example, the input would be stored for 4 frames and then come out even if you are too early. So when you count the frame of timing it right, there's essentially a 5-frame window, or 5 times the amount of leniency for an otherwise 1-frame link. The specifics of input buffers and input readers, as well as different leniencies and shortcuts for motions, are a part of the joy of moving and acting across fighting games. They really make each and every one of them feel pretty different. And I knew that when I was playing and recording things, the videos, I'd switch between one game or another and it would totally mess me up. Though by and large I can say that from Street Fighter V and VI, that sort of era, things were made more or less simple. We also see simplification of character movesets, removing things developers deemed as unnecessary or overly complicated, as well as the simplification of motion inputs for some specials and even the removal of motion inputs altogether, and in many cases linearization of combos and offense into planned routes and outcomes, such as auto combos and generally canned offense. I will say that canned offense is an especially apt term, because in many cases you do need to use some form of meter to crack open the can and get on-demand offense. By shrinking the space of what a developer considers acceptable, and giving all characters sets of shared tools to handle all common scenarios, by the design of the system, characters inherently become more homogeneous. There's also the interesting trend of robbery through strong comeback mechanics, which we can see in Street Fighter V's V-Trigger, though there are earlier examples in MVC's X Factor. And to be honest, I can go on, and I will throughout the video. As for how the skill curve goes, this one's going to be quite interesting and could stir up a lot of discussion. For the most part, this is really more or less hypothetical. If we assume optimistically that these design elements did work to onboard new players, then the new player level will be higher than it used to be. Additionally, because the games are designed to be simpler, and the executional requirements to put those ideas into practice are easier, we can also say that the skill floor is a little bit quicker for players to reach. However, these same features also work to lower the maximum possible difficulty within a game. As an example, a 1-frame link is now far more than 1 frame of leniency depending on the input buffers. These games, at least executionally, can only really get so difficult, so I'm going to have to put that skill ceiling right here. Because of the limitations of game design and how few hard and practical optimals there often are, surprisingly, this skill ceiling is actually only a little bit higher than that skill floor. In fact, this skill ceiling, for sake of argument, is actually so low that most professional players are more than capable of reaching it. They are more or less capped here by the skill ceiling. Of course, in practice, since these games are played against other people, there is still skill differentiation in areas such as neutral, allowing one player to be better than another, but as far as executional tricks within a game, they are far more limited. Here we are at Street Fighter 6. Given how it was released so recently, we don't have as many games released after it to point to its influence, but we do have some funny examples. Grand Blue Fantasy Versus, in one of its final patches, went out and released the universally hated mechanic called OD. Then, after the community emoted their way into a sequel with rollback, the first beta comes out, taking some inspiration from a plethora of system mechanics likely inspired by Street Fighter 6's vast drive system. Then after the Street Fighter 6 beta comes out and we learn a little bit more about the game, the Grand Blue devs found out that Street Fighter 6 wasn't actually about drive impact, but was about drive rush. And so now we have 6XL in all its glory. But that's more or less a little bit of a joke and a little bit of conjecture as this era is still unfolding. We also have Tekken 8, and this is the first time that I've mentioned the Tekken series so far because I'm not personally well versed in 3D fighters, but it almost seems to lag one trend behind, where Tekken 7 bucked the trend of the Street Fighter 5 era and was praised for it until Leroy. Ugh. Then Tekken 8 has its rather controversial heat system, one of the forced aggression mechanics as I like to call it. But don't worry, I do love Dragunov mirrors as much as the next guy. From my perspective, most eras are reflections and reactions to the previous ones, and this era is a reaction to the dry, defensive games that Street Fighter V, Tekken 7, and Grand Blue Versus, for example, became, immediately adding new mechanics to force aggressive and active playstyles, such as raw drive rush cancel, the heat system, and 6XL. In addition, as developers became more skilled in their ability to develop and plan down to each interaction in a fighting game, these system mechanics can also include some catch-all features to provide a ceiling to unintended consequences, pressure, and situations, namely Street Fighter 6 Parry reducing all mix to strike throw. Many qualities of the Street Fighter V era, such as lenient input buffers, reduction of the importance of motion inputs, and auto time to mix an offense, still exist. And as of the time of writing and recording this video, the League Fighter Alpha had just recurred, marking it as another game that has its own take on this current formula, which was actually one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video. As far as skill curve goes, much of what applied to old games still applies here. In some ways, Street Fighter 6 is harder than Street Fighter 5 in terms of having more to deal with, while having a similar execution barrier. Yet, system mechanics also take away from the focus on other foundational elements of the genre. So I would argue that the skill curve is more or less the same, or at least not different enough that it's worth arguing about, and that the main differences come from the more aggression-oriented design and its downstream effects. Let's take a look at the skill curve again and see what it implies. Let's imagine, for example, a player farther along the skill curve plays someone to the left of the skill curve. Who wins? Ideally, the player on the right of the skill curve wins. How much do they win? In a perfectly deterministic game without varying factors and the graph accurately assessing how good a player is at execution or determining the game state to their win condition, then for the sake of argument, the player on the right always wins. Of course, people playing games aren't points in a graph with their own Dragon Ball Z power levels. Okay, that'd be pretty cool though. As much as people do care about all 9 ranks, player effectiveness can also vary due to factors such as energy level, warm-up, matchup familiarity, personal habits, player matchups, controller being bad, not enough sleep at a venue, list goes on and on. That's why ELO is sort of in a percentage-based thing. If we assume some variation in both players' play, then theoretically we could also say that there are some points where a player lower on the curve wins, but not necessarily to a large degree. It is, by design, fairly consistent. And the more consistent a test is at accurately determining who is more skilled, the more often that the player on the right of the curve should win. So where does variance come in? When we break down film of fighting games from across all areas, we inevitably come down to situations that could be best described as RPS, or rock, paper, scissors. And yes, I do mean that rock, papers, and scissors. Many up-close interactions, especially as a result of pressure applied at an advantage state, happen at such quick, unreactable speeds that commitments must be made to defend, similar to guessing at rock, paper, scissors. For instance, Street Fighter V is a very clean game, if not a dry game, with an interpretation of strike throw that is very similar to Street Fighter VI. Let's consider a scenario where a player has one neutral and has knocked the other player down. They are now up close, and the weighted RPS is their reward to do more damage. For instance, if a player is standing there and doing nothing or pressing buttons, a strike will hit them. If a player is blocking, the strike will not hit them, though the offensive player still has another point-blank advantage situation. Instead, to break open a player that is blocking, we throw them. Thanks to the presence of meaty throws, we are also able to throw them as they are getting up in place of a strike, and it will still beat their wake-up mashing, but a strike meaty will do far more damage. In order to break a throw, you must tech it by inputting a throw yourself. Naturally, if they don't necessarily do anything, your tech input, since it's the same input as a throw, will just lead to you attempting a throw yourself. So far, in its simplest terms, block beats strike, throw beats blocking, and throw loses to teching, but strike beats teching. However, even a game like Street Fighter V has its own form of OSing. Street Fighter V has a throw tech window of 7 frames. That means after a throw touches you, you have about 7 frames, or a little over of a tenth of a second, to be able to input this throw button yourself and neutralize a throw. In practice, this means that you can tech at a delayed timing, such that if they were to strike, you would block, but if they throw, you would tech. That's known as a delay tech. Given that it does not leave you vulnerable to a strike while still beating throw, this is generally considered a superior option, as it covers 2 options instead of 1. Beating the common options that we have presented, we need to move past the first layer of our game plan into our second layer. One new option that emerges is to shimmy, which is to walk backwards and allow their delayed throw input to come out, and then punish it with an attack. Coincidentally, this would also defeat reversals, which are invulnerable attacks that beat both strike and throw once again, but with great risk. These are some of the interactions that define the up-close game of Street Fighter V, and these general principles, while the specific interactions depending on the game and the system mechanics, will generally hold. Ultimately, many situations and many forms of mix can come down to RPS scenarios, or 50-50s, with the implication that you just have to guess at some level, implying a level of randomness or gambling. While dealing with probabilities and outcomes for RPS, it is important to talk about how many right guesses or openings it takes to win. We generally refer to this concept as touches to kill or interactions to kill, and expectedly, when dealing with probabilities, lower interactions leads to more variance and randomness in outcome, as opposed to higher interactions, which would more or less approach the expected values in the long run. In terms of conditioning and in practice, not as on a spreadsheet, having more interactions also gives a player with better reads more chances and more information to understand the other player's patterns better, and thereby eliminate the randomness. Seemingly, this randomness is an obstacle to avoid or to control. For a purely skill-based game, why would something like this randomness be necessary at all? Shouldn't randomness just be removed altogether from fighting games? Options in fighting games are generally designed around human reaction times. Many studies exist for reaction times, just a core fundamental idea of psychology, and so we have a lot of great numbers, but for the purposes of this video and just in practice, we can give a general benchmark around 250 ms or 15 frames. Reality is, most situations in fighting games are different from reacting to whether a green light or red light appears in the screen. In practice, throws are unreactable, dashes are semi-reactable, and jumps are entirely reactable. However, maybe due to committing to other actions, difficulty positioning, or just being overwhelmed, even Big Bird will miss a really important anti-air at Evo. Congrats, Punk. So what plays into this variance in reaction times? According to the fighting game glossary once again, a mental stack is defined as how much focus a player can devote to different strategies in a match. When a person's mental stack is filled by one thing, they may react to that specific situation better, but flub another one. Similarly, focusing on too many different things can lead to a person being overwhelmed and just not react to any of them, which can be described as a mental stack overflowing. Which honestly brings to mind that programming term, so similar to how a processor has to change course entirely when a branch does not occur as they predict, players are often slower when encountering things they don't expect at all. Much of fighting game mind games revolve around conditioning the other player by threatening one option, thereby loading their mental stack for that option, and then switching to another that they do not expect. As a reward for good neutral, players who have better neutral can gain more knockdowns and more favorable RPS opportunities, as well as avoid getting knocked down and facing that RPS. Ultimately, RPS is a core feature within fighting games, and the reasoning is very simple. If all actions were to be within the semi-reactable to fully reactable timing windows, then there is just no mix. A player will never get opened up and no one will get hit. A better player would simply react to everything. In fact, guessing well is such a core concept in fighting games that it stands as one of the pillars of Laugh's theory. According to Laugh's theory, we can categorize fighting game players into three overall archetypes, being mind, body, and heart. Mind being winning through game knowledge, body being winning through execution, and heart winning through reads. We can take this to also mean that there are three avenues with which a player can win or a player can improve. Based on our skill curve discussion before, we can see that execution has been de-emphasized. Whether you believe that fighting games have been simplified or not, we can also say that modern internet allows for way faster sharing and discovery in games, causing knowledge to be less of a differentiating factor. What's left is reads. We've briefly discussed conditioning, but what allows for a player to control these varieties of outcomes in their favor, aside from informed guessing? This is something that was covered recently in a video by Diphone explaining that we can assign expected reward to options, especially given the numeric values that we can attach to options in the form of damage, allowing us to assess risk. Through game theory and probability, well-explored sciences allowing players to achieve consistency in literal gambling, players can evaluate the amount of expected reward each choice would give in a long enough term. Funny story about this is, once I knew someone at the start of Grand Blue Fantasy Versus original release. That player kept track of other players' tendencies and did the math for Jita, estimating that it was worth going for a reversal half the time when they were minus. So now you know why. While a little misguided, this person utilized the principle of calculating the reward from each scenario, the likelihood of each scenario occurring, and then evaluating the expected value of each situation, allowing them to know for themselves how often they should choose an option. However, what that analysis did not yet take into account is specific player tendencies and conditioning. Because fighting games are mostly not played on spreadsheets, a player is able to get a read on another player and understand that they may want to reversal, thus seeking out that option and punishing it. They may understand the general likelihood that a player may choose one option over another by identifying their habits, while also choosing counter options that may be best suited towards dealing to those exact habits depending on the game system. In fact, they may go out of their way to play in such a threatening way to condition the other player to make them want reversal and punish exactly that. One of the most basic conditioning patterns, for example, is to go for the rule of three, where you show them an option twice, once to demonstrate it, and a second time to teach them and build a pattern. With the third time, you alternate to punish their counter option. Good players may know that this is happening and stuff this out by trying to punish exactly what you did last time, or the reverse. Maybe they'll do a no mix-up, where if you are expecting the rule of three, then another player may do the option a third time, a fourth, a fifth, playing chicken with them until you force them to respect it. This can be seen in that funny video of Daigo throw looping a Zangief, but honestly, you could see that probably once a set in Street Fighter 6. What's interesting is that this particular analysis of situations in terms of expected value and referring to modern fighting games as gambly or even casino games carries underlying assumptions that shows the flaws in these design systems. Namely, we assume that thanks to low executional barrier and how buttons are designed and interact, that even a player who is not practiced can frame perfectly and gaplessly execute these mix options built into the game systems, which are in turn designed to force the other player to guess. Whether it's Johnny Donuts or Daigo, you have to respect it the same and guess the same. When we take a look at offense within a fighting game, we can examine it as a generalized reward for winning an interaction in neutral, or gaining an advantage and reaching them point blank. Most commonly, these take the form of knockdowns, which can also happen as a result of combos created of good offense, allowing for repeated offensive sequences. Some characters who may be more oriented towards long-range zoning, or have some advantage such as a resource that they may gain, can sometimes opt out of this offensive opportunity for their other reward. Starting off, we will be diving a little bit deeper into one of the most basic forms of offense in the Street Fighter series, strike throw. As a reminder, this offensive pressure is reliant on the general concept that striking will beat an opponent who is not blocking, and throws will beat blocking but lose to defensive options that can leave the defender open to a strike, such as mashing, teching, and jumping. We will also examine other forms of mix, such as high-low mix, where an offensive player attacks an opponent with an attack that must be blocked high or low, as well as set play, situations where a sequence of actions taken after a knockdown can create the mix options mentioned above. We will dive into these sequences in more detail to investigate the knowledge and awareness that is necessary to defend against these options, diving into the system mechanics that underlie these interactions and their ramifications. By comparing the differences in these system mechanics, from the input buffers to executional leniency to the placement of the characters after these interactions, we're going to be able to see how pressure has become more linear and harder to escape. As it has been discussed at length by others and would honestly deserve its own video, I will only minimally bring up motion inputs where relevant. Throughout this video, I will also mostly be picking examples from the Street Fighter series, especially Street Fighter 6. This is in no ways an attempt to single out Street Fighter 6 as a poor game or as the worst defender, but rather as a good game with a clear design philosophy that I will then in turn evaluate at a critical level. So let's get to the lab. First off, let me show you an example of a knockdown that Karen gets after a basic mid-screen B&B. Using the Orochi Ender, I am able to get point-blank Oki using H command dash. In Street Fighter V, there are 3 types of recovery: normal recovery, back recovery, and no tech. With command dash, we are able to be close enough to cover all 3 options. Once point blank, we can set up meaty strike throw, as well as point blank tick throw setups that they cannot mash out of. We notice that after I press standing light king, the number displayed is +2, which simply refers to the fact that I will act 2 frames before the other player, allowing me to press a second button faster than them, thus interrupting them. This is known as a frame trap. You can notice how thanks to generous input buffers in Windows, I am able to essentially mash out what I want at each step without necessarily paying too much attention to timing that I want at each step, and as a result, I am then rewarded with frame-perfect pressure that cannot be interrupted. As mentioned before, in order to handle strike or throw, we can delay tech to cover both options. However, that in turn loses to shimmying. How else can we handle a throw? First, backdashing or jumping will allow them to avoid a throw, but leaves them entirely vulnerable to strikes. Reversals, as we've discussed before, are high commitment ways of turning the tides on this offense and getting them off of you, but blocking those reversals will lead to a large punish. Certain characters also have unique parries which allow them to defeat meaty strikes with great reward, but instead those also lose to throw. Coincidentally, Colleen also had to take parrying high or low into account. Then V-shift, which can be simply thought of as a variation of a backdash, but for Karen as an example, you could punish them after whiffing a meaty throw, but it did allow them to escape a strike. Street Fighter 6 shares many of these basic options, which was perfectly demonstrated by a video called Let's Go Gambling. So, let's go gambling. First, there are many opportunities for us to be able to set up pressure similar to how we did in Street Fighter 5. In Street Fighter 6, after a basic knockdown, many characters can drive rush with a button that will grant them advantage, setting up strike throw, or possibly a meaty overhead. Once again, strikes and throws will beat mashes on wake up, but in this case, for many characters a throw will also allow you to throw them again when they are in the corner. Delayed teching also will beat both options, but interestingly enough, because of slightly larger throw range, an earlier tech timing will actually catch them walking backwards, forcing higher commitment options such as a neutral jump or a backdash, unless you think they will tech really late. If your meaty strike is blocked, of course, the same scenario essentially repeats itself with strike and throw. In fact, we can notice how, especially with the situation of Ken's drive rush standing medium punch, that this attack is essentially so telegraphed with how he turns green, in addition to the lengthy block stun and hit stun, that they are given a lot of time to react. This allows them to be able to enforce these scenarios very cleanly and very accurately. Once again, players can jump out of throws at the risk of being hit, and in the corner they can backdash and punish a throw at times. Note that the exact math on the frame data of both the whiff throw and the backdash are what would allow for this interaction. Some characters, in fact, can avoid meaty throw with their own risky options. And once again, reversals are a surefire way to end up in a meme. Now let's examine what the drive system adds to this RPS. First, drive impact loses to throw, and technically armors through some attacks, but most characters can simply cancel their own attack into their own DI, so that doesn't actually work here. Next, drive parry functions as a harder callout to strike, but also loses to throw, much like parries did in Street Fighter 5, but instead of being character specific, everyone will have it. In addition, if you parry an attack with the first 2 frame windows of your parry, you will perfect parry it and be able to punish. But if you do not and you hold parry, you will simply block all attacks, whether they're high, low, or cross-up, and gain some slight drive meter. But this state loses even harder to throws. Essentially, when it comes to drive parry, all mix will eventually be boiled down into strike or throw. So we can simply think of this as a higher commitment block. Finally, drive reversal is a wake-up reversal that can get the other player off of you but leaves you -6 on block. This is similar in functionality to other tools that have existed through the Street Fighter series, such as V-reversal or alpha counter. You can think of this also as a lower commitment DP, and this in fact will give a wake-up option to characters that do not otherwise have their own personal EX reversal. Note that all of these options that I mentioned for the drive system do not fundamentally cover different sets of scenarios from the existing options, but more or less serve as differing levels of commitment on top of the same strike throw RPS. Now let's talk about Third Strike for comparison. I really think that Third Strike is an apt comparison in many ways because it is also an incredibly throw-heavy game. Just as Ken does in Street Fighter 6, Third Strike Ken can put you into the corner in one interaction, where he can then threaten with throws until you open yourself up to a strike. He's just in fact the closest equivalent to himself. So before I would begin, I would also like to mention that Third Strike is an incredibly deep game with incredibly layered, complex, and interactive RPS. Players really have many different interpretations of the interplay of the mechanics thanks to the richness of these system principles. For my part, I will honestly try to keep this as simple as I can. Firstly, in more classic editions of Street Fighter, strike throw is supposed to be a little more simple in theory. In principle, strikes will hit someone if they are pressing buttons, but will lose to someone who's blocking. Throws will beat blocking, but instead, throws will then lose to someone else's strike or a barre. This in turn leads to strike again in a cycle. How this is actually implemented in Third Strike is that there are 6 frames of throw protection on wake up and out of block stun. This means that when you knock the other player down, throws against them will whiff during those frames, giving the other player enough time to wake up with an attack. To set up your own throw, you must then meaty their wake up attacks, which would then lose to blocking and parrying. Keeping the discussion on parries relatively simple, on the ground you can tap forward to parry high, or tap down to parry low. When you tap, you will input a parry with a 10 frame window, but if you hold the button instead, the window will just be 6 frames. If you parry in one direction, you won't be able to parry in that direction again for 23 frames. If you stay in neutral after the parry ends, you'll leave yourself vulnerable after that parry window. During the parry itself, you will not be able to tech the throw, but you can cancel that parry by blocking or with the button. Unlike the other examples that I've shown so far, the numbers themselves really are not as important, merely the rules that they outline. Simply put, a player can parry high or low, but spamming doesn't necessarily work. In addition, parrying loses to throws. At its most basic level, we can see that the principles of Street Fighter hold up true in Third Strike. Defenders must consider if you will strike or throw on their wake up. Like in Street Fighter 5 and Street Fighter 6, you can delay tech. In fact, much like Street Fighter 4, you can crouch tech, where a crouching light punch will come out instead of a whiff throw on a crouched tech attempt. So where do Third Strike mechanics begin to add more layers to this RPS? Where things really begin to get interesting is the throw protection window. Within those 6 frames that you would be able to block an attack, coincidentally you cannot be thrown. For those 6 frames, an option such as block or parry cannot be thrown. If they want to throw you as soon as possible, they must wait until after this period. You could of course just press a button, but then they could just parry you and then throw. Instead, you could jump. This option, known as guard jump in Third Strike or fuzzy jump or 171 in other games, allows you to be able to use throw protection to your advantage, covering strike, throw, and even shimmy. What's important to consider is that when you jump in Third Strike and in many other games, you do not leave the ground immediately and will enter pre-jump frames. During these frames you cannot be thrown either, but you will then be vulnerable to strikes. Guard jump is therefore one of the most simple and powerful OSs in the game. With an understanding of throw protection, teching, and parrying, players can come up with OSs on the fly. Between all of these different wake-up options, how on earth do we break someone? What do all these options have in common? At least for how these options play out in Third Strike, we really can pay attention to one common theme. After an initial period where that OS occurs, if we leave them alone, another action will come out. For guard jump, the pre-jump frames will occur. For stand tech, they will whiff throw. For crouch tech, they'll whiff crouching light punch. And for parry OSs, once they return to neutral or whatever particular option they choose to package with their parry, all of those options will leave them vulnerable to strikes of a delayed timing. We can compare this to Under Night, which, before Under Night 2 had an option select that allowed for shield on whiff, which won against delayed strike. They would then remove that in Under Night 2 so that you would get a whiff throw instead, putting it more in line with what we've seen in Third Strike. Strike throw mix in Third Strike then becomes a cat and mouse game of whether they'll take that initial mix or run the risk of an OS. That would then open them up to a delayed strike. In practice, players honestly don't stick that strictly to a 6-frame delay timing as there's just no input buffer. Instead, players will generally develop their own personal timings. I'd consider a delay of 10 to 15 frames or approximately 1 reaction window to be more typical, but players are of course capable of altering and adjusting these timings. These micro delays and timing mind games have a rhythmical, musical quality when playing. When we take a look at our earlier discussion and compare this to Street Fighter V and Street Fighter VI's strike throw game, we can first see that the basic RPS of Street Fighter V and Street Fighter VI are intact in Third Strike. Then Third Strike goes above and beyond to add layers to this RPS. Unlike Street Fighter VI's additional mechanics, these Third Strike techniques allow you to dynamically cover more options, at the risk of creating new, emergent vulnerabilities. These choices enhance the layers of the game and add a level of personality to each player's gameplay. In spite of its general removal, the value of the throw protection window isn't lost on Street Fighter V and Street Fighter VI's devs. 2 frames are already present to prevent weird late grab interactions while enabling meaty throws that would then stuff a wake-up mash. In fact, many situations are created to emulate throw protection. Cammy's +1 crouching heavy punch leaves her far enough to where her throw will whiff without a micro-wall, but coincidentally leaves the ability to throw 2 jabs. Similarly in Street Fighter V, Season 5 Karen's corner throw left her at a spacing where you have to micro-walk to be able to throw again, but you could still meaty them with a button. These micro-walks by design are meant to create a minor delay between consecutive throws, even if done as possible, emulating throw protection without the substance of it. In most cases, Street Fighter VI is meant to place characters point-blank in situations where the RPS is in fact quite linear, limited, and repetitive. When we talk about Street Fighter as a series, we can think about how the strike-throw game is fundamental to the core of the game and its offensive language. However, strike-throw mix is far from the only mix that's present throughout the Street Fighter series, with many characters specializing in their own unique mix options. Street Fighter VI, thanks to possible anime influences or as a reaction to Street Fighter V's dryness, added high-low mix in greater fashion, such as drive rush overheads. In diving into drive rush overheads in more detail, we will see that they are still subject to the math-like principles of design and systemization. In Street Fighter VI, by default, most overheads are -3 on block and +2 on hit, leaving them safe but enable a combo. Drive rush, which increases the frame data on both block and hit by 4, changes this math to instead be +1 on block and +6 on hit, allowing for a link with a 6-frame medium. Through picking an ender that provides the correct knockdown, we can drive rush immediately and then mash out our overhead to create a situation where they cannot mash and must block high. Let's examine the +1 on block scenario. Since throws are 5 frames, a 4-frame jab from the defender will tie in terms of speed and beat the throw as per Street Fighter VI's specific rules. If the offender wants to frame trap this jab, then they will have to use their own jab and beat them using that own 1 frame of advantage, but if they hit instead, this jab will lead to a weaker combo otherwise. Therefore, there is a slight advantage in this situation for an offensive player who's able to confirm these situations visually instead of choosing one over another, but it is going to be rather minute. By and large, these frame data interactions for drive rush overheads are true of the entire cast. Exceptions, such as Akuma's overhead being +3 on hit rather than +2, do exist, and this is because his own optimal medium confirm, his standing medium kick which will leave the opponent standing, is 7 frames rather than 6 frames, but coincidentally on block, this will leave him with the same interactions above. For the most part, All of the rules of Street Fighter 6 are hard-coded in such a way that these singular frame differences in startup, or on block, or on hit values will determine their interactions entirely. Because Drive Rush will add +4 to block or hit, all moves that are -3 by default will be made plus. On hit, this changes what will link. Therefore, the on-hit values in general must line up with the startup of other buttons, depending on what is intended to combo or cost meter. Given our earlier example where a Drive Rush overhead leaves someone +6 on hit, we can see that their optimal routing is to link into their 6-frame medium, and due to the form frame input buffer, this is actually a 5-frame window to link into. We can see that this also provides a hard ceiling in terms of execution in links, where a player who can consistently link within a 3-frame window or a 1-frame window cannot go for a harder link that provides more damage. It simply doesn't exist. It makes it mandatory for a low-level player to study and know exactly what to route into, and for a higher-level player to go no further. In fact, just in explaining this minute scenario, we can see that it has taken an extreme amount of math and knowledge, none of which is inherently intuitive. Don't worry, it gets much worse. Interestingly, Ken, much like Cammy, is one of the characters who, in exchange for a slightly stronger strike throw, lose access to a standing overhead to Drive Rush with. Instead, Ken gets his own run stance, which enhances his moves for combos, as well as carrying built-in mix with very defined interactions as well. For instance, while Ken enhances his special attacks for combos, he will also gain a poke, an overhead kick, and the ability to stop and go for a low or a throw. This concept of building in carefully controlled, acceptable mix into special attacks or states is something that we will also be discussing later. For now, we can just take a look at what run overhead does in-game. First off, the magic number is +30. What does that mean? In a similar fashion to before, much of the mechanics of modern fighting games, especially their generous input buffers, means that it's rather hard to mess up situations, or rather, hard to vary them at times. For instance, by itself, run overhead is +3 on hit and -3 on block. Let's remember that you are unable to Drive Rush this attack, so you cannot add 4 to the frame data and allow for it to be plus. Coincidentally, it also has 3 active frames, meaning that you can get hit by an attack for 3 frames. Much of the time, you will be hit by that first frame, so the values on block and on hit are exactly as you'd expect. But you can get hit by an attack on its later frames in the rare cases of running into it, or that they hit you in the later active frames of the attack as you are getting up. This is the strictest definition of a meaty. Since Ken run overhead is +3 on hit and -3 on block with 3 active frames, coincidentally, if we are able to get a hit on the 3rd active frame, thus hitting 2 frames late, we could be +5 on hit and -1 on block, which would allow us to be able to confirm into a 5-frame normal while still being minus on block. Interesting to note, this on block scenario is more or less the reverse of the on-block scenario that we investigated earlier. The magic number is +30 because run itself will take 10 frames, and then the overhead 18 frames, for a total of 28 frames when mashed as fast as possible. On frame 30, run overhead has come out for 2 frames, allowing you to hit on the 3rd frame, achieving the scenario above. There are, also coincidentally, many knockdowns costing meter or some damage trade-off, which then create a +30 knockdown, thereby allowing us to access this automatically timed canned mix. Interesting to note that in general, Ken's option to cancel his run and hit low also work on the exact same setup that the overhead does. Because of perfect parry, all mix in Street Fighter 6 must contain a throw element, or be neutralized entirely. This run overhead example goes even further. When we get a knockdown with Run Tatsu on an airborne opponent, which we can set up using our target combo, or drive rush into that target combo, we are plus 42. If we mash jab and it whiffs once, since the move takes a full 12 frames on whiff, we would delay that 12 frames and achieve a plus 30 scenario. On the other hand, Ken's dash is 19 frames, so if we dash twice and burn 38 frames, we are left plus 4 in their face, allowing us to throw. Since the game has a throw protection window of 2 frames, we will be able to throw them on the later active frames of our throw, since a throw is active for 3 frames. Do note, this concept exists for Akuma as well, with the minute differences in frame data. For instance, from El Tatsu's sweep, he also has the magic number for an auto-timed safe jump as well. Given that Run Tatsu more or less puts them in the corner automatically, leading to the situation which we are well familiar with, they may decide to backdash. Most characters have the exact same backdash of 23 frames, with some notable examples being slower, which coincidentally is the same as the whiff recovery of a throw. Given Ken's advantage after the double dash setup, he is safe after they backdash to escape the throw. This is also an element where the individual frame of difference is taken into account when balancing. Let's re-examine the Meaties scenario once again. As discussed before, attacking with the later active frames of a button will make it more plus. If we were to choose to not spend the meter to open the can for offense, we can still meaty with standing medium punch. By default, it is -2 on block and +4 on hit with 4 active frames. In theory, if we were to hit on the 4th active frame, we could improve the frame data by 3, allowing it to be +1 on block and +7 on hit. This could allow us to frame trap with our own jab. This spaced +1 scenario, of course, is very similar to the spaced +1 scenarios examined before. And lo and behold, there are frame kills for this from very common enders. Interestingly, the pushback from the standing medium punch prevents us from being able to mash out a tick throw without moving forward, since our throw will whiff, which would force us to use the meter to achieve the above scenario with far less effort. But aside from that, let's take a look into the implications of a meaty. In order to meaty and hit with the late active frames, we will have to time our button to hit at the exact same time, the first frame where they are getting up. With perfect parry being a 2-frame window, the consistency of these meaties will force a player to hit them at the exact same time where the perfect parry could consistently work, assuming of course that they execute it at that right time. Let's look at the math again. Since parries have a 2-frame window of leniency, and jabs take 4 frames to start up, we could hit at frame 3 or even frame 4 to be able to then nullify their wake-up jab and also be able to avoid the parry. But we would then be in fact trading off the frame data advantage of a meaty. If we were then to decide that we wanted to still be able to frame trap, but wanted to avoid a predictable perfect parry timing, we would then have to use a weaker option, such as jab pressure, or opt to use a meter again. Given the reward of perfect parries within this framework, it has been argued that meaty throws, and even meaty throw loops, must exist for this option to be handled. Without arguing on whether or not this is a necessity, it is entirely reasonable logic for that decision to be made. However, this does loop back into that predictable scenario that we have discussed before. Interestingly, from the Season 2 patch notes, Ken and Cammy, both characters who traded off standing overheads for a stronger strength throw game, faced minor nerfs to their corner game. Now, when they do a throw in the corner, they are pushed back further out. Specifically for Ken, he can dash up and be +1, unable to meaty throw as outlined in the +1 drive rush overhead scenario, but will get 3 jabs. He can also choose to walk up and meaty throw, but in that scenario he would only get 2 jabs if he walks up. Cammy, however, doesn't get to dash up and does get the 2 jab scenario or the meaty throw. In fact, jabs were given extra proration to combos as of the Season 2 patch, Therefore, both characters are extra incentivized to run their offense around the corner meaty throw, a decision which most of the cast already makes. As we can see from these examples, system mechanics, not just the drive system, but the logic baked into the interactions and the frame data of the game, lead to these predetermined and homogenized interactions across the cast. While we are tempted to point out that increased knowledge and communication within the scene lead to a quicker discovery of tech, at the same time, such choices made for the game's system indicate that they are in fact designed to be solved. Depth only exists insofar as the developer understands and intends. At best, Street Fighter VI is a game that's like a clock, with the individual pieces interlinked and working together. At worst, digging under the hood reveals a wildly charted out and numeric game, from the frame data for each character unified down to each individual interaction. So far, we've only discussed some of the ways in which modern fighting game design, as illustrated at both its best and worst by Street Fighter VI, cause these scenarios to be predetermined and linear. It brings to mind an older interview with a Capcom employee about MVCI which stated, "If you were to actually think about it, these characters are just functions." This at the time was meant to refer to the new replacements for a beloved cast of characters sharing functions with the newer ones, and therefore should satisfy those fans. In this specific case, it brings to mind how character uniqueness is inherently limited by the rigid design philosophies and a shallow pool of ideas as to what is permissible. It is a controlling paradigm that does not appreciate fluidity, player expression, and unintended discovery. It's not like you can't just patch it out if something's really an issue anyways. You can characterize Street Fighter VI characters in terms of the tools that they have, to the point where you can more or less estimate their tier placement based off of basic factors when watching a trailer. Do they have a cancelable low forward? Do they have a good EX reversal? Do they have a fireball to drive rush behind? What's their cash out damage? Each character exists as a point within the design space that is the Street Fighter VI system. Characters are created based on a recipe, where a rushdown character like Cammy may have the power budget to have the tools that the Street Fighter VI system determines are the frames and links that a rushdown character should have. This is formulaic to the degree where mostly minute differences are what defines a character. The best characters are the ones with the best ability to enforce the game's looping offensive flowcharts to win how the game wants you to win. Within an archetype, Shoto's as the clearest example, individual characters are quickly invalidated by the smallest of changes, because even though on paper they are able to execute the same flowchart or do similar if not more damage, they provide little unique reasons to play one over the other. So why not just choose the best? Where there are character-specific interactions, especially unintended ones, we can point to two recent examples. Hayao's Hugo during Third Strike's Evo avoided Ken's Super R3 using a widely seen as useless move. Specific hurtbox and hitbox interactions allowed him to avoid it entirely and win. Uma's Jury in Street Fighter VI's first Capcom Cup low-profiled under Chris Wong's Luke Fireball and punished him, leading to his $1 million and subsequent retirement to VTuber fandom. These interactions define a fighting game's unique kinetic qualities, to where their twists, bends, and jumps truly do affect their ability to bob and weave, just as a real fighter would. We celebrate Hayao's unique moment as an instance of great knowledge, skill, and understanding of the soul of his character. And yet Capcom had went ahead and took out Jury's unique profiling hurtbox interaction to bring it in line with everyone else. This, of course, is despite the fact that it was a difficult technique that costed super meter, giving the move more usage than just as a reversal during burnout and the occasional combo ender. It becomes apt to say that these characters are not just functions. They are the system itself. In fact, the system as it is designed, down to the frame data of the moves, is so rigid and interconnected, It is truly difficult to imagine changing one piece of it without that change leading to a stream of interconnected unintended problems. If I were to talk about this in terms of programming design philosophies, we can consider that this drive system is a system that is tightly coupled with cascading consequences. If we were to remove throw loops, perfect parry is now too strong. If we change drive rush frame data, the combos in this game drop, and the oki no longer functions. If I were to decrease a button's startup by 1, it may give them unintended links, but adding 1 frame of startup may ruin their entire combo structure. It is an exercise in madness. For a breath of fresh air, Third Strike Ken is once again a good way to show contrast between games. Despite Third Strike being a game with also incredibly strong system mechanics, there is significant variance between characters, individual interactions, frame data, and therefore, player expression. In terms of overheads, Ken is very simple with 2 practical options. He has the universal overhead done by pressing both mediums, as well as back medium kick. 6MK, which is similar to his run overhead, is not really that practical. First, back medium kick is +1 on block and +3 on crouching hit. In practice, because of the pushback and the parry system, the +1 to the frame data does not simply allow the player to take their turn without thinking. The +3 scenario is very interesting. This will allow you to execute a 1 frame link into his Super 3, which Street Fighter 6 Ken Level 2 looks like. This 1 frame link is a real 1 frame link thanks to no input buffer, but at the same time you could make it easier to execute with special techniques like pianoing the kicks. For universal overhead, it's more interesting. This by default is -6 on block and +0 on crouching hit point blank, with 8 active frames. In order to get a confirm from it, you will need to space the UOH far enough that only the later active frames hit as Ken moves forward in order to confirm it into super, or you can hit it meaty as they are waking up. In the case of a meaty, with enough skill and spacing, you can even go into LDP. Because characters can choose to tech or stay on the ground when the knockdown is not caused by a super, frame kills can be difficult. Meatying is more manual. I must say that all of this difficult tech is far from necessary to play Ken at a proficient level. In fact, hitting the UOH late gives the defender more time to parry and punish. The game accommodates play at both a very simple level, where you can avoid these risks, as well as at a very complicated level, where you can then show your mastery. In the case of Ken's left-rights after a mid-screen Super R3, there are some frame kills, also used to disguise slight microwalks, and you jump after that with slight unseeable delays changing which side you land on. Because every character has different wake-up timings as well as are spaced at different positions, the setup will differ per character. Some characters land far enough or have unusual hurt boxes that make it less practical. Therefore, it is not necessary to do and even hard to do, if not impractical in some cases. But a master who familiarizes himself with these manual timings can also choose this as a form of self-expression. And if it is something that the Ken is going for, you still have options. Even though it is a left-right, it has very interesting interactions with the parry system. If you high parry one way, you are actually holding back the other direction, since a parry is done by tapping forward. This allows you to parry one way and block the other way, giving you a high-level way of controlling the situation. In fact, if they see your high parry and opt to go low instead, since down parry is done by tapping down, you actually can parry both ways when they are going low. Of course, by default, since you can block both standing medium punch and crouching leg kick in one direction since they are both mids, you can just choose to block left or right, which brings us back to the original mix. If they choose to throw, you can escape it in the ways mentioned before, or just take the throw as a low damage option from a high risk setup. With Third Strike, you are given a lot of options and variety as to how you approach a specific scenario. Even with a very difficult mix scenario, you can manage it with option selects that deepen the mind games, unlike Street Fighter 6's easy and rigid options, which more or less are just levels of commitment to existing reads, rather than transforming it and adding layers. But that's Ken. Everything that I talked about there was specific to one character in Third Strike and how they interact with their respective system, as opposed to my sections in Street Fighter 6, where for the most part, I actually discussed solely system mechanics and design features which all characters share. So let's talk about Third Strike Yun, one of the strongest and most infamous characters in Street Fighter history. Just as Yun is strong, he is also difficult. We will show how Third Strike also designs for defense by feel, and how tough offensive execution can help a smart defender get reads. We will also get a glimpse into different win conditions in Third Strike, as opposed to characters who serve as extensions of centralizing system mechanics. First off, when we look at Yun as a character, we can see that when compared to Ken, many of his normals are shorter in range than Ken's. His longer pokes carry significant risk. By contrast, he has very powerful tools, such as one of the best dive kicks in Street Fighter history, mostly contested by himself in Street Fighter 4. He also has a command grab which he can combo from, enforcing a lot of pressure up close. In all likelihood, he was intended to be, and can be played as, a pure rushdown character. However, because of Genei Jin and how meter build works in Third Strike, we can see that he emerges as a much more dynamic and interesting character with a unique win condition. For instance, characters can build meter by whiffing. This allows Yun to build towards his win condition of Genei Jin at a distance, despite being a rushdown character. In addition, since whiffing a button places out a hitbox, whiffing your faster and stronger pokes can also be additionally used to catch an option such as a dash, despite the fact that Ken's dash is 12 frames. We will discuss this more later. We can see that from the rate of meter build, it is unlikely for Yun to be able to build his entire super art bar from whiffing, unless the other player sits in place for the entire round. But he can still threaten this option and force the other player to approach Yun, despite the fact that he was originally a rushdown character. Unlike what you would consider a zoner or a spacing character who prefers to play far, as mentioned before, Yun does not carry the pokes that would dominate neutral at extreme spaces without risk. Instead, Yun is a unique character who controls situations through a combination of counter pokes, spacing, movement, and threatening to turn the tides and play offensively instead to keep his opponent off balance. In addition, as Yun manages to score these minor wins throughout neutral, such as a stray poke, or an anti-air, or a throw, they also serve as a means for Yun to gain meter, or even as an opportunity to begin to play aggressively. This can become a matter of situational decision making, taking into account elements such as the meter situation, health, corner positioning, as well as personal habits such as their own defensive options and your own defensive capabilities. This draws many similarities to the risk analysis and expected value calculations we mentioned before for point-blank RPS. Yet each decision plays towards outcomes that are not as immediate or binary. Let's say that Yun does take the opportunity to play offense after a knockdown. First, Yun is capable of playing a basic strike-throw game just like Ken. While Ken's standing medium punch is only +1, Yun's is actually +6, though this doesn't actually make it far better. In order to confirm off of this normal, Yun either has to go into his target combo, or into standing light kick more or less immediately, rather than hit confirming. Next, this will not actually frame trap since there is no gap between these options. If Yun wants to frame trap, he can go for crouching medium kick instead, but he would lose the hit confirm on his standing medium punch, and then have to hit confirm off of the 12 frame window of the crouching medium kick instead. And that is by no means a guarantee. If Yun decides to use this as a tick scenario instead, we can see that he's actually placed so far that he has to walk up much further in order to tick throw, giving the defender a tell to respond to, instead of forcing a point-blank guessing scenario. In fact, by default, Yun's throw has a smaller range than Ken's, forcing him to walk even further up, or to utilize a kara throw, where you whiff cancel a normal into a throw after one frame, thanks to the game's input system. Better kara throws like Chun's allow her to throw outside of the range where she may get back thrown, granting the offensive player control. This is another instance of difficult tech that can allow a player to demonstrate skill, but is not at all necessary. Like Ken, he can also use crouching light kick, crouching light kick. Unlike Ken, Yun's crouching light kick isn't a chain, nor can he link on it based off of the frame data, but it does have a unique property where he can cancel some of the recovery frames to barely link into itself. This, of course, gives it a very small window to execute, making it a difficult option with minimal reward damage-wise, but opens up additional layers in this offense to prevent a defender from being able to only think about throws and high parryable options. Recovery canceling will also come again later. If you become confident that a particular Yun cannot and will not execute this link, you can defend against him more easily, just as knowing that if he cannot kara throw, his throw will have less range. Execution therefore adds layers, complexities, tells, and reads into every facet of these interactions. Without execution, interactions would adhere to the hard and fast rules set in place by the frame data, without personal expression. It reduces the beauty of this genre that I love deeply. It isn't just offense that is made more binary through the lenient execution and shallower pool of interactions, but defense. Of course, we have gone through a lot of examples in modern fighting games where, as a defender, your options are more or less just limited to those guesses and numeric knowledge. Through large input buffers, a defensive mash is more likely than not to come out as soon as possible. Therefore, offense has to be similarly frame tight, even built in to work. It also creates a burden of knowledge on the defender. In our strike throw examples for Street Fighter V and Street Fighter VI, knowing the exact scenario that occurs after a +1 on block button down to the particulars of the throw spacing is required. In the Yun tick throw example, however, whether he is +6 on the standing medium punch or +1 on the crouching leg kick, there is still that tell of the walk forward, on top of the throw protection. If we see that Yun is inching forward, we could in fact just mash, where strike beats throw regardless of the frame data specifics. The Yun could parry that mash, regardless of the frame data specifics. There are also human gradients, such as how precise a person can time or space their micro-walk into a throw, or how quickly and confidently they can micro-walk, or if they even micro-block or micro-walk, or if they have a kara throw. Each person's play, down to interactions as simple and fundamental as a micro-walk throw, carry personal expression and are intuitive to read. Seeing that someone is walking up and hitting them is something that is baked into the DNA of neutral, not even offense or defense, and is far more intuitive than the knowledge of a +1 versus a +2 point-blank interaction after a drive rush alters the frame data of a normal. While modern games appear more simple based on execution and system mechanics, it ends up being more unintuitive, charted out, and rigid, whereas older games attempt to design where the play is intuitive, even if the rules that create this intuitive feel are deep and nuanced. In addition to these basic options, Yun has other personal meterless tools. For instance, Yun downright has a command throw. As with most command grabs, you can't tech it. This command grab also switches sides, taking you out of the corner, as well as giving up valuable space and control. However, like any grab, you can rely on throw protection and OS to cover it. As for Yun's dive kick left-rights in the corner, I can keep this one relatively simple because we've actually covered one of the main counter methods before. Much like dealing with Ken's Super R3 left-rights, you can also tap parry to cover both sides of this left-right. Since Yun is in the air for this, forcing him to go low also changes his timings, which is also a slight tell. And if he goes for throw, it will be even further delayed. If the defender tries to OS as before, you can of course hit them at a delayed timing. While a little bit risky, I personally like using standing medium kick because the launcher is very satisfying and easy to confirm. If I will assume that they will parry for a large punish, I could use Heavy Punch and invite this parry, stuffing out the button after they press parry, unless they choose a weaker option like throw, which I could then shimmy. There are gradients to choices in interactions, rather than one-to-one answers built in. Back to Yun. All of those nuances and minor interactions are more or less a means to his end goal of Genei Jin. Given his low health and comparably low damage output, going hit for hit against Ken is a losing endeavor. Instead, Yun should take safe, successful interactions that will incrementally allow him to build resource. Once Yun gets enough of these stray hits, or is lucky enough to get a confirm, he is either at full meter or close to it. While meter allows access for many characters' win conditions in Third Strike, how they end up using that meter changes how they approach these situations. For instance, Yun only has 1 bar and cannot store 2 to 3 Genei Jins, unlike Ken storing 3 Super Art 3s, or Chun storing 2 Super Art 2s. Once Yun is at full bar, he caps out. Yun can choose to activate from full screen and use his buffed abilities to threaten the opponent, forcing them to respond or slowly approach the corner where he can then begin his offense. The longer this takes, the less time he has for offense, where even one minor mistake in neutral ends this win condition. Yun can also begin to play aggressively even before he is meter, choosing to build this meter on block and then activate Genei Jin from a special cancel. If he's lucky enough to get a hit, he can full confirm. We can see that on block, most of his options are going to be high parryable, except for his crouching medium kick, which only confirms on hit if you are capable of hitting a 1-frame link after the activation. We can see that this is another point of skill differentiation leading to enhanced mind games, where much like the crouching light kick link, if they are unable to execute their low option, a player can then take this knowledge to cover their high options and shut down their game plan. Once Yun does get in, things get interesting. First, in Genei Jin, Yun's crouching light kick is 2 frames and plus 13. Despite it sounding like an MVC2 Magneto button, the numeric specifics does not matter as much as the particular effect. In addition to being so plus, Yun is able to recovery cancel his normals in Genei Jin, this time allowing him to alter his pushback on block. This allows him to keep you in a frame-tight block string. But by itself, believe it or not, there is actually no mix involved here. Unless you decide to stop blocking, you will not take damage from this block string, and he will just run out of meter. In order to do damage, Yun must intentionally leave gaps in this pressure, either by manually delaying to frame trap or catch jumps, or to wait even further after throw protection wears off to command grab, which gives even more meter but less damage as opposed to the frame trap option. If Yun wants to overhead, he can forward medium kick, which is minus on hit surprisingly, or go for universal overhead setups, which in particular are very tough to space, much like Ken's setups. In principle, as the defender, it actually becomes much more straightforward than expected compared to what we've discussed before. The frames matter less than understanding a Yun player's habits or tendencies. Most of the executional difficulty exists on the Yun side, where once again, this can be a place for the defender to get a read on the opponent and get out of these situations. Despite this pressure being frame tight, Third Strike allows you to deal with frame tight block strings with red parry, allowing advanced players to red parry then back throw Yun and escape this situation entirely. This forces Yun to vary his frame tight pressure by going to his alternate block string with standing medium punch canceling into crouching light kick, which you could instead high parry. As Yun is walking forward with crouching light kick, he has to hold forward as soon as possible when doing a crouching attack in order to recovery cancel and stay close. This constant down forward motion often leads to accidental light kick up kicks, which is a dead giveaway for a full punish, making it just as likely for a new Yun that Genei Jin can lose him rounds as much as it can win him one. If Yun is too slow in this, however, he will just push himself out of range for throw instead, letting you block and escape. If the Yun does not have UOH setups, then taking damage from overheads is negligible. Yun is supposed to base his pressure off of the threat of his strikes and his command throw combos, which build more meter than a strike route. If the Yun does not have proper combos from certain situations, such as for that command throw, or always misses his ender, you can disrespect those situations entirely and just block. The legendary power of Yun is locked away behind offensive execution, to where until at an extremely high level, something that you might see in your average Street Fighter 6 game is both tougher to break out of and more damage. Even through these skill gradients, you are able to identify habits and know what the other player can do, to know what defensive options you should or do not have to take. And even in Genei Jin, Yun follows many of the simple principles of Third Strike, where executional skill grants them access to unique power that you otherwise don't need to watch out for, and that throw protection will force him to approach and leave himself open in order to throw. And yes, guard jump can be used here too. Rather than understanding the exact numbers behind Genei Jin to do the math on whether a specific gap can be mashed out of, situations are much more clearly plus or clearly punishable, and more emphasis on pushback and positioning allows them to be visually read instead. Of what we've examined so far, we can see that my Genei Jin section was actually surprisingly less numeric. As that defender, there is comparatively little burden of knowledge for the frame data or the specific combos and routing for each character to defend, but for the offensive player to access this power, will have to care. Through knowledge of the system, combined with understanding the unique effect of Genei Jin, defenders can just focus on reading the player's executional habits. This in some ways actually nerfs the level of offense that a new player has to deal with, because when they play other new players, rather than forcing them to know quickly how a certain gap can be jabbed or punished by the numbers, we know that instead we can focus more greatly on understanding the player's habits, or even just focusing more greatly on neutral and stopping the Yun from approaching his unique win condition where possible, rather than just him starting with the meter to do so and enforce these scenarios. In addition, we can also see how different and varied the win conditions are of Ken and Yun, but also how they interact and interplay with the strong mechanics of the system, rather than taking from the system the exact same thing. Yurien is also unique, or Makoto. They take different things from the system, and they win in different ways. The system itself, such as the frame data, ought to inform these situations to create these interesting effects, rather than define them. System mechanics, and ideally character mechanics, should be created and used for the purpose of capturing specific ideas for characters, rather than for characters to fit within a variation of that system. When we investigate these specific examples of how offense in the series has changed over time, we can begin to notice the effects of these changes in design and in the system. In modern examples of strike-throw mix, built-in mix scenarios create situations where a defender must guess, and are limited to the handful of options that exist in those frame-perfect scenarios. For other types of mix aside from strike-throw, we can see that for the offensive player, the situations are well defined, with mathematical properties that define these interactions. What is possible is more or less set in stone based off of the frame data and the setups, where it becomes incredibly clear to solve what works and what does not. All of these characteristics lead to defending against them to be a knowledge-heavy and risk analysis-heavy game. Compared to Third Strike as one example of a classic title, we can see that the systems allow for more layers on top of situations, and more options for both players. When we take into account executional differences and opportunities for players to choose more difficult options for intricate variations, we see that this allows for much more player expression. Furthermore, because these options are more difficult to execute and are not designed to be frame perfect, there is more variation in each interaction, allowing for defenders to read these player tells and defend against their pressure by feel, rather than solely based off of the frame data and the limited options that are available. When we evaluate offense in the design of modern systems, we can see that they are very difficult to stop, given their executional leniency, auto-timed options, and frame-perfect qualities. These offensive pressure sequences force a player into situations where they must guess with limited options, based off of their risk-reward or the player's past behavior. Inherently, as to the nature of offense as a reward, these interactions are designed to be calculated in the favor of the offensive player. We will investigate from the perspective of the defender as they push the opponent out from point-blank range to stagger range and poke range, eventually reaching neutral. Through these examples, we will also discover something new, that the defender is not necessarily encouraged by the game system to return to neutral, but rather to turn the tables and enact their own guessing game point blank. We will also examine how pokes have changed within this context, in a concept that I call Anime-ification. Let's re-examine a familiar point-blank interaction, drive rush standing medium punch as Oki. We can see that this whole interaction is telegraphed and takes so long, down to the hit stun and the block stun, that it passes into the reactable threshold. Since both players are given time to be able to fully react, they also have the time to process the situation and the frame data. We can recognize that they are +2 and point blank. This is similar to the situation that we analyzed before. Since they are +2, we also know very statically that it's their turn, since lenient input buffers will ensure that both buffered actions will happen at the earliest possible frame. As a defender, this input buffer can actually backfire against attacks with low block stun, creating large windows where any fuzzy mash would get frame trapped. Within a 1 frame gap, because the input buffer stores inputs for 4 frames, on defense, this coincidentally turns a 1 frame gap into 5 frames where you can press a button and be frame trapped. This may be another reason for longer block stun, which makes these situations more reactable as well. Since we have covered the throw scenario before, let's assume that after drive rush standing medium punch, that this time the Ken goes for a strike. Ken cannot jab twice in this scenario based off of the exact spacing of the pushback, as having a 3-hit block string here was out of his power budget. Ken is instead incentivized by the math and the spacing to route into standing medium punch. In this case, if it was on hit, Ken routes into a strong confirm, but on block, this is also a strong frame trap. As the defender blocks this second button, Ken is now -2. Standing medium punch has enough weight and hit stun to be designed for the offensive player to hit confirm, sitting at a 16 frame cancel window for specials and a 17 frame window for his target combo. This allows for both Ken and the defender to recognize the situation that the defender blocks. Given Ken's poor frame data on block for his special attacks, he is unlikely to cancel into a special as a frame trap from this spacing. Because Ken's target combo from standing medium punch to standing heavy punch is no longer a frame trap, the defender can assume both things and then decide that they can safely mash. It is the defender's turn. At this particular spacing, Ken is still relatively close. Does the defender have a jab that reaches Ken? It's possible if Ken walks up. At -2, if the defender responds with another button that has longer range but has a longer startup, is the additional frame of advantage going to allow this button to win? For instance, in choosing a 6 frame button, does it trade with Ken's 4 frame button? If Ken walks back for 4 frames instead of pressing a button, does it cause your 6 frame button whiff? In this exact scenario that I set up, Luke's crashing medium punch won't whiff either way. The Ken could try to perfect parry, which would cover both a 6 frame and a 7 frame button given its 2 frame window, knowing that an 8 frame option could possibly be interrupted cleanly with his lights. If the defender does not press a button and the Ken parries, they can walk up to throw him. The defender can also respond with crouching medium kick. If Ken blocks, he will have a chance to run the math from his side, but from a longer range and with different frame data. Or, the defender can instead choose to cancel into drive rush without particularly confirming. On hit, the Ken will be in the corner and we can run the scenario listed earlier. And on block, they are point blank and plus. In both options, that scenario starts all over again but with the names flipped. This can be broken down into a very literal flowchart. Furthermore, this situation also illustrates how strict power budgets are, such as the startup of the button. Changing a 7 frame normal to a 6 frame normal has radical implications on these math-like interactions, as well as their entire combo structure. Even having a slightly better 6 frame normal compared to others could allow them to break these spacing traps and reach at locations that others may not. Our fighting games have become Kafkaesque. This rigid turn-based logic on defense extends to special attacks and mixed scenarios as well. While set play could also be considered a rote set of actions leading to a finite list of results, with executional difficulty causing inherent variance, or enough varied situations, choices, and interactions to create more variety, it is at the very least able to be thought of as cooking a dish with fresh ingredients, as opposed to opening the can. We really could talk about the many hours of Third Strike Yun videos or his spreadsheets, or the documents for Third Strike Urien or Street Fighter 4 Ibuki. The list really goes on. We could also consider the difference in wake-up times or juggle weights, hurt box sizes, unique defensive options. All of these documents place the burden of knowledge on the offensive player for executing, whereas the defender may only need to consider if the end result of said mix is a high-low or a left-right. Instead, we could also consider one of the more egregious examples of offense straight from the can: special attacks with follow-ups intended specifically for mix. Special attacks with follow-ups are not a particularly new concept. For instance, the Rekka Ken from Fei Long, from which Rekkas are named, are a series of punches where as you input the special again, he will follow his sequence. In principle, the mind game is whether he will continue this sequence in order to frame trap, or if he will reset pressure. In modern fighting games, this is mostly the same, save for the motion input. In fact, this basic mind game of whether someone will frame trap or reset pressure is at the core of modern fighting game pressure. In Street Fighter V, Karen's Rekkas were removed, and outside of V-triggers, Rekkas were forbidden because of how powerful they would be in this exact system. Alpha 3 Karen was also an early example of a character with Rekkas that carried mix, having high and low options from it. This idea has spread, even into specials which may not have a Rekka hit, but enter a state, stance, or situation with follow-ups, having things like high or low options. We can quickly revisit Ken's run stance, where his enhanced specials are combo tools, but his kicks are built-in mix options. His heavy option is a poke mostly used in confirms or neutral. His medium option is the overhead that we have discussed before, and his light option will allow him to cancel the dash and start his pressure. As mentioned before, because of the parry system and drive impact, all mix in Street Fighter 6 will require that feint option or a throw option. However, Ken also has another canned mix special, Genei. Genei kicks is a series of Rekka kicks with light, medium, and heavy options, and then a light, medium, and heavy follow-up. EX Genei is mostly used for combos. Depending on the specific button it is cancelled from, as well as the version that it is cancelled into, changes whether the option is frame tight, a block string, or interruptible entirely. On block, these first kicks are going to be minus 11 for the light, minus 7 for the medium, and minus 2 for the heavy. Then for the follow-ups, Ken can choose the quick light low ender, the medium overhead, and the heavy being that combo tool. After each of the individual starting kicks, the gap between the follow-ups will vary per version of the follow-up kick for 9 combinations. Then the low ender itself is minus 5, the medium ender is minus 3, and the heavy will whiff on crouching. Calculating the risk-reward for these options in each interaction is an exercise that I will leave for the reader. DJ Sway is an evasive move that will also allow for several follow-ups. Much like Ken's, light kick is the low, medium kick is an overhead, and that heavy kick is that combo tool. As expected with this system, in addition to being able to choose to feint this, DJ can run up with his sway to catch a parry attempt to throw, and then still be able to feint backwards off even after that. Cammy Hooligan and Akuma's Demon Flip also deserve quick mention as being exceptionally similar tools, serving as mix options best used after certain knockdowns that would trade damage for precise knockdown volumes for the setups. Both options cause them to jump at a arc, and then give them high, low, dive kick, and feint options. Cammy also gets a throw option, which Akuma traditionally had in place of feint. Akuma instead can air Fireball and air Tatsu from his EX flip. Whereas both low options were -2 in Street Fighter V, they're now both plus in Street Fighter VI. You just have to know that. While it would take a large effort and even more time to evaluate each option in each context, there's honestly minimal difference in these situations once it's charted out. Akuma's overhead will just leave you point blank but plus, while Cammy's will leave you point blank and minus. Both lows are now plus. Dive kick options will depend on spacing, but are best used in a setup to make them plus, once it is determined which combination of command jump version and dive kick version are proper. Akuma has a setup which will leave him plus and point blank on a feint, while Cammy has a setup off of her target combo, where she can trade damage and corner carry for an auto-timed set play opportunity. Therein lies the rub. These special moves for built-in auto-timed offense are intended to work, and are also easy to balance. When we return to the reaction windows earlier in this discussion, we notice that people can react within certain periods of time. When converted into frames, we can then say that an option having a certain amount of frames of startup implies whether it is supposed to be reactable or not, and adjusting these one way or another is very simple. For instance, Cammy's high hooligan option is 18 frames, and Akuma's is 16. DJ's medium kick follow-up is 25 frames, and therefore has the power budget to be plus, but leaves him outside of range for immediate throw, emulating throw protection. Because his low option is 12 frames and minus, one is intended to first block low, then block high, an option select called fuzzy blocking. Similarly, Ken's low option is 6 frames while his high option is 18. In Ken's case, because of his spacing and the large gap, you are intended to mash when he goes high. To nerf or buff any of these options, we could lower or raise the startup of these options, or create or remove gaps, or add more route enders that give the magic number for these setups to work. In general, across the system, combos are centralized into routes, where leaving some damage on the table can lead to better setups. If Cammy does not choose to end her target combo into her damage ender, she can hooligan. If Akuma chooses to sweep instead of LDP after an LK Tatsu juggle, he can double dash for throw, or get a safe jump. If he does not choose to do the sweep, he will have better options to use Demon Flip. If Ken chooses to run Tatsu over LDP, he gets the aforementioned double dash Oki, or can frame kill into run mix. If Ken chooses to route into Dragon Lash and give up that additional ender, such as an HDP, he gets a safe jump on the side switch. Power budgets are strictly defined, where setups are evaluated as costing a certain amount of damage for these specific opportunities. Defending against these options as a player also requires playing into these numbers and knowledge checks. All of these scenarios have developer-specific intended answers, or RPS based on the frames. Especially since these options do not typically push the offensive player back at all, knowing these proper answers is vital to each matchup. The burden of knowledge is instead on the defender to understand, study, and evaluate the risk-reward for these options, which by themselves are very simple to execute. Once we successfully defend the point-blank interaction, they are slightly pushed out into a key spacing which illustrates a point of differentiation between Street Fighter V and Street Fighter VI. Since most buttons of Street Fighter VI are minus, and plus buttons are meant to be point-blank meaty or stagger options, there exists a dead zone where you're pressuring and end up minus. Street Fighter V, for comparison, famously had plus buttons all around the cast. What this creates is a situation similar to the Ken example earlier, where after his pressure ends, he's minus but close, allowing the other opponent to take their turn, usually in range of a crouching medium kick that can convert into drive rush. We can also see this with other pressure strings such as light strings, which tend to leave you within crouching medium kick range. What is most baffling, however, is certain close-ranged poke options like Cammy's standing medium punch. At 6 frames with minimal range, this is intended to be a pressure button, yet it's -1 on block, without the ability to special cancel from it, where Cammy's special attacks are largely unsafe anyways. We can compare this button best to Karen's standing medium punch and crouching medium punch, which are +1 and +3 respectively. These buttons allow Karen to be able to frame trap, as well as to be able to discourage mashing. This allows you to stagger from mid-range and work your way back in. In Street Fighter V, Cammy's own standing medium punch sits at a nice +3. In Street Fighter VI, after she uses this attack, it is practically a guaranteed turn for the other player. She can use this as a way to poke at the opponent with reward on a hit, but on block, while she can spacing trap jabs, it leaves her generally too close to avoid crouching medium kick drive rush. Instead of using a poke like standing medium punch, at those farther ranges you are just largely incentivized to use your own crouching medium kick and drive rush yourself, largely removing this situation entirely. There are certain specific options like dive kicking as a read that would counter this response that carry its own risks, but largely as a result of the inherently minus buttons in Street Fighter VI, we can see that this turn exchanging happens incredibly frequently and incredibly constantly up close, with the option for them to just be point blank even more with that drive rush cancel. This leads to volatile up close interactions, rather than the offensive player being able to control the situation through things like frame traps and plus scenarios. Rather than being pushed away over time, the game intends to keep players up close and constantly guessing back and forth on these guess-heavy, math-based interactions. If a player chooses to return to neutral rather than re-engage, we enter the poking range. As with tightly interconnected and complete systems, their design patterns do not exist in a vacuum, nor are they isolated to its smallest component, but reflect throughout the larger whole and mirror each other. Where this frame data heavy, turn-centric design also begins to bleed into the neutral can first be seen through pokes. From far away, we can take a look at mid-range pokes such as Cammy's standing heavy kick, Chun's standing heavy punch, and Ken's standing heavy kick. Cammy's standing heavy kick is a dominating 11-frame poke in neutral that allows her to control other opponents from disrespecting her spacings. We can see that this move does not push her back very far, and that on block it is -3, buffed from -4 from last patch. Running the numbers, we know that this prevents the move from being punished on block when up close, and in fact it is now plus when used from drive rush. Ken's standing heavy kick, at 12 frames, is also a strong poke with slightly lower range and little bit higher recovery, but with an interesting property where on punish counter, it launches the opponent very far up, giving you the ability to combo into run DP, or drive rush standing heavy punch run DP, or other things. Not only does Ken more or less stay in the exact same place relative to the opponent, he can set this spacing up from a spaced standing light kick. At -5, he is basically able to loop standing heavy kicks as a spacing trap, where if they do not choose to respond with a large enough poke of their own to break the spacing trap, he can threaten with all of his usual options. So things like drive rush jab, fireball then drive rush jab, dragon lash, drive rush then dragon lash, walk up and crouching medium kick or standing heavy punch into M Genei or drive rush, forcing them to respond with their own crouching medium kick, which you could then destroy with your second standing heavy kick instead. Chun's standing heavy punch, however, sits at 13 frames, far nerfed as a pure poke from Street Fighter V, but instead, much like Ken, can situationally convert from this poke into a combo with her stance. At -3, Chun is safe and can choose to do this poke again or walk up, but can also cancel this into stance for pressure, which has its own set of rules and interactions. Using these 3 pokes an example, but really this extends towards all buttons in the game, the pushback is so low that it forces another interaction. We can see from our earlier examples that pushback can also define when a pressure ends, and how difficult it would be for a player to re-engage, such that being point blank and +2 is a much stronger scenario than being farther out but +6, due to needing to walk well over 4 frames to regain that point blank spacing. In older games, Pushback can even telegraph frame data, where fast moves that kept you close were intuitively plus, while moves like reversals, which are slow and leave you close, were intended to be punished. In the gray areas, we can also see that pushback from staggers and pokes affect the ability for the offensive player to keep the defensive player locked down and force them to make decisions, influencing the pace of a match. When determining generalized pushback, we can use what some have labeled the sweep test. On block, when spaced, does the sweep push them back far enough to keep them safe? In Kyokuji's tweet on the topic, he shows several key examples. In Third Strike, Ken's sweep leaves him safe depending on the matchup, but against Chun, she can punish with specific counter options like Super. Ken can also do this with his own Super R3. In A3, we notice that sweeps push you very far back. In Super Turbo, we notice there's a lot of pushback to certain scenarios, to where Fei Long's Rekkas are a notable way to avoid this pushback and continue pressure in a way that others cannot. Because of the strong pushback, Rekkas served as a unique and defining trait that worked with this system in a very special way. In Street Fighter IV, this characteristic also holds true for Fei Long as well, where the Rekkas on block will push him away, but continuing the sequence pushes him back in, allowing him to be safe yet extend his pressure. When comparing the two versions, of course, one thing that I noticed in labbing is that Super Turbo's version actually is pretty nice, to where when you do the third hit of the Rekka, you can actually nicely space yourself to where you're still safe, or at least appearing to be safe, as opposed to in Street Fighter 4s or in Rekkas that you're probably more used to, where choosing the second or the third hit of the Rekka is going to put you just at that point blank. In Street Fighter 6, Jamie's first Rekka is safe on block that way when set up properly, but after that, all bets are off. When we compare Karen's Rekka in Alpha 3 to Street Fighter 5, we first notice that A3's pushback is high and the Rekkas sort of bounce her in and out as well. This is a quality that exists throughout the game. But in Street Fighter 5, the spacing is set in stone and the sweep option just leaves you point blank punishable. You're like right there. When pushback causes an interaction to return to neutral, or at least far enough to where the buttons will not clearly reach, the frame data does not enforce interactions, but instead serves as a soft suggestion as players generally return to neutral, unless they of course re-engage with more committal options such as jumping. Unlike the modern paradigm of point-blank interactions, neutral does not hold clear turns or advantages from one player to another, such that interactions and patterns cannot be flowcharted or mapped out. There are just too many options and personal variations with variable spacing and timing. Instead, understanding a player's neutral habits and poking and prodding more safely become more important. These characteristics enable players to play more by feel. When we take a look at the sweep test, we also reveal another large characteristic of modern fighting games. When a sweep is blocked, a player is intended to take advantage with their own punish, a combo that honestly was likely found by someone on Twitter within a week, that a new player then must study for this exact scenario. When we take a look at sweeps themselves and compare them to many pokes, we run into an interesting observation. Let's evaluate sweeps within the same principles of risk-reward and expected value as we've done throughout the video. Ken himself in Street Fighter 6 honestly has one of the better sweeps. First, sweeps carry good range and attack low. On hit, we can get a knockdown. However, on block, you are liable to being punished. At 8 frames, this places sweep as a safe but risky callout option with minimal damage reward. When we compare this to standing heavy kick, we can notice one key difference. The sweep is never able to be converted. Traditionally, when we take a look at past iterations of the standing heavy kick, such as third strikes, or super turbos, or alpha 3s, he was unable to get a conversion, but the button itself was a powerful poke with decent reward from a straight hit. Generally, the newer the game, the less pushback. While by itself this can be an interesting addition, we can see that other significant examples such as Chun's standing heavy punch, that other pokes have also been transformed more from powerful buttons whose presence contributed to stability in neutral into buttons that can convert into combos in exchange for better space control when compared to previous versions. Because more options and conversions are possible from neutral, this disincentivizes winning through control or spacing, but rather from obtaining that specific confirm option into then our predetermined offensive options. Where pokes once returned us to neutral with small damage and screen positioning, our best pokes are now the ones that offer us Oki. Due to the massive corner carry and even side switching options off of many confirms, playing for screen positioning is less rewarded. This signals a shift from slow grounded neutral into a game that focuses on combos and conversions, an effect I call Anime-ification. When we analyze Street Fighter V and its history as a game, we noticed that at some points it had been considered an extremely dry game, with moments of robbery once V-Trigger was activated. As a counter-reaction to this criticism, though I can also argue simply an extension of modern fighting game philosophy, we can see characters gaining more tools, widgets, confirms, and combo routes. This fighting game maximalism, as I call it, is intended to emulate the power and complexity of a character such as Third Strike Yun, who provides incredible depth and exploration, while neglecting that Third Strike Ken is just as incredible, while having very minimalistic combos. In addition, thanks to a patching philosophy tied to nerfs over buffs as a philosophy, instead of seeing a character with a strong conversion removed, we are more likely to see that conversion's damage turned a little bit lower, but with a new conversion exchange, and other characters that are buffed just simply get that new conversion. This leads to a general rise in conversion and combo abilities within a game over time, which was very useful in a drier game like Street Fighter V, but within a complete package on release like Street Fighter VI, highlights where this trend will take us. Because of this power creep, we will find that stray hits are rather rare and at times just a place where a conversion was simply missed. For example, Guile's 2MK can link into flash kick on counter hit, Sobat kick can link into a 5 frame on a counter hit which can then route into drive rush, and even upside down kick gets you a full punish counter stagger, which allows you to convert into level 1. Even Guile's pokes are not strong enough for simply poking's sake. The difference between stray hits and combos is not simply the knowledge of the confirm that is required, but also the inherent reward in the combo as well. Compared to stray hits, combo conversions typically deal much greater reward as well as corner carry, a knockdown, and its subsequent Oki reward. This becomes a scenario where we can then route into our flowchart for that particular knockdown. It becomes increasingly likely for any small interaction in neutral to be able to start someone's pressure routes and grant extreme reward, where cash out confirms are also incredibly easy with how centralizing and damage dealing drive rush and super R3 is within combos. We can see that essentially a sweep, a fast and punishable poke that only grants knockdown on hit, is essentially a power crept, outdated, and simply a forgotten button. If anything, it's just a new player trap that more experienced players tell them to stop using entirely. These combos and conversions, while still having a capped executional difficulty thanks to input buffers and simplified motion inputs, become additional homework for a new player to memorize to approximate reasonable damage output for particular interactions and punishes. We can compare this once again to Third Strike Ken, who only really needs to worry about the particulars of special canceling into an LDP or a Super R3, a very simple concept, while also offering a much higher skill ceiling with Kara DP combos, difficult single hit confirms, and links. Third Strike Ken is an example of a character that has a very low skill floor and an extreme high skill ceiling. Between the combos and conversions needed to do the necessary damage to win, as well as the knowledge on offense and defense necessary to understand and deal with those developer-intended scenarios, it becomes easy to understand why new players may mention needing to lab too much, or end up staying in the lab too much, instead of learning the game by playing. Through analyzing offense and defense individually within modern fighting games, we are able to better understand the underlying implications of the systems and their resulting impact on matches and their outcomes. Through input buffers, long block stun, and negligible pushback, small differences in frame data are enforced, resulting in limited, knowledge-centric, gambling-based interactions that loop. We can also see that Street Fighter 6 in particular, even when compared to Street Fighter 5, encourages players to switch turns and for the defensive player to constantly stay glued to the other player, instead of returning to neutral through many minus frames on mid-range buttons. Even pokes are more heavily geared towards pressure rather than space control. The spacing traps created from those limit the set of possible interactions from the other player, and in turn allow those very pokes to confirm into combos when the defender twitches. From these various conversions, characters can also cash out and expand that extra meter, though they largely do more damage off of these interactions anyways, reducing the amount of interactions needed to win a round, which in turn leads to increased volatility. Despite this, when analyzing the skill curve between a new player and a more experienced player, we can understand that while volatile point-blank interactions and high damage would inherently lead to more random results, a player who is able to better control neutral would at least be able to limit the amount of guesses and keep that risk-reward in their favor. However, we will next investigate how system mechanics and tuning in neutral also contribute towards the gravity of players colliding into these volatile interactions. Neutral, unlike the other components of fighting games, has always been about being like water. In the words of the immortal Bruce Lee, "Be like water making its way through cracks. Do not be assertive, but adjust the object, and you shall find a way around it or through it. If nothing within you stays rigid, outward things will disclose themselves. Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless like water. If you put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. If you put water in a bottle, it becomes the bottle. If you put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend." What this teaches us about neutral is that Footsies is like a dance. When a player takes space, we can retreat. When they retreat, we can take space. Through these fluid interactions, players increasingly learn about each other, planning, counter-planning, and ultimately aiming to be formless. This is wholly and substantially unlike anything that we've covered so far in this video, and it's ultimately why people love the ground-based footsies that Street Fighter is known for. Frame data does not define interactions or situations, but instead inform them and color them. Because one fireball or poke has more recovery than another, does not mean that we will instead immediately react and invalidate that option, but that it holds more risk. Instead, we can think of ourselves as water flowing through those cracks, where threatening to jump over a fireball can stop a zoner just for a little bit and grant us space to approach. Rather than look for hard and fast rules to apply to neutral or binary scenarios to enforce in neutral, ideally, we are instead to follow general principles to help guide and inform our decisions. There are many places to learn about neutral, or more specifically footsies, such as the Footsies Handbook. From Chapter 1 down to the very first element, we can see that momentarily stepping in, then out of range of the opponent, can cause a reaction. This, of course, is whiff punishing. In order to take a distilled set of principles and to distill it even further, we will work with the implications of that first element, and display it in a form more commonly known as the Footsies Triangle. First, let's take a look at this element again. Essentially, we step into their range to cause a reaction, and then step out of our range to avoid it and give us an opportunity to punish it. What is at work here? Why would another player press a button just because we step a little closer? If you are a person with no previous knowledge of Street Fighter but have made it this far in the video, we can actually understand this force at work through remembering a set of interactions from the beginning of the video. If another player were to hold their ground and stay still in neutral, we can see that immediately no buttons will really reach the other. In order for a character to hit one another, one player must walk forward to close the distance and then press a button when they reach. The defender, of course, can hold their ground, but if we remember at the start of the video and throughout, throw beats blocking, and a character with a fast walk speed can close that gap and throw. This fundamentally forces a response. Much like our previous example of intuitive design, our strike, once again, beats a player walking up to throw. Therefore, in order to prevent a player from approaching, especially if both characters have similar range, a player must place their poke either immediately as the other player walks into range, or occasionally, even as a player is farther out but walks into that range, to gain just the slightest bit of that range advantage. Therefore, pokes tend to be approaching. When we revisit the first element, we can see that countering this tendency by walking into the range then out of their range is something that can bait a poke out and allow us to punish their whiff. Players who are exceptional at whiff punishing, such as Punk, can often alternate between approaching and looking to whiff punish, in a back and forth dance that lulls the opponent to sleep, allowing them to approach, or causing them to flinch, which he punishes. Through some of the best fundamentals in the world, he can win without pressing a button. For a player who is trying to punish a whiff, they must create this whiff by moving backwards from where you would expect them to be. If a player does not bite and instead blocks so that they aren't risking a poke, they can instead see that the other player steps forward, then steps back for a little while. If the defender is farther ranged, they can take this opportunity to just walk forward and take that space, approaching the opponent and inching them to the corner. If the defender was quite close, they can chase the opponent down and hit them with a long-reaching low, such as low forward, which they will not block if they're walking backwards. What is interesting and unique about these interactions in Footsies is, like unlike the other scenarios in the video, as per the definition of neutral, neither player is at a state of advantage over one another. Neither player is forced to guess. Because these situations do not inherently force guessing, they are non-committal and can happen without button presses. All of these actions and interactions happen continuously and blend together. When we consider our previous discussion on interactions to win, and where the more interactions, the more variance we are able to eliminate, we can conjecture on a theoretical level that since neutral happens continuously, that the sheer number of micro interactions that happen greatly reduce variance. A win in neutral is typically built through many successful micro interactions over a round. When we investigate the drive system in Street Fighter VI, the single feature that ends up dominating neutral is Drive Rush, in both its raw and cancelled versions. When done in neutral out of a parry, Drive Rush can be seen as a faster dash that costs meter, like an EX dash. Fast dashes aren't new to Street Fighter, but Drive Rush has its own unique wrinkles, such as adding forward to the on-block and on-hit values. These extra frames allow for great reward on hit and on block. In addition, Drive Rush also has a unique momentum to it, such that characters will slide in when they press that button, often reducing the pushback that would otherwise occur from a regular version of that same normal. For a character like Jamie, we can see that Drive Rush transforms his attacks and give them their own back and forth momentum. Drive Rush offers great flexibility that traditional dashes do not. First, you can use any normal during Drive Rush, attacking from many different ranges and speeds with entirely different momentums. This can be in fact a character's jab, their best poke, or their most favorable hitbox. If you choose to use a special, you can halt or alter your momentum entirely. Believe it or not, the examples that I'm showing you are actually done too slow. When we take a look at the frame data of Drive Rush, we can break it into several parts with unique characteristics. First, Drive Rush in neutral is done from dashing out of a parry. If done as fast as possible, the parry will only last for 3 frames before the screen flash occurs, lasting 10 frames. Then there's an 8-frame startup before the button will occur. On paper, this gives you 21 frames or 18 frames after the parry before an attack will reach, very close to the frame data of a raw dash. But thanks to the variety of options they have, checking the Drive Rush is a rather complicated affair. There's actually a lot of interesting properties to Drive Rush, which I would like to examine. This in particular I have not seen too much discussion on. When we take a look at the frame data again, we notice that a screen flash occurs, then afterwards there's an 8-frame startup before the button can come out. First, The screen flash pauses the game, preventing all movement and button presses from the other player. If you are not moving, you cannot move. If you are attacking, the button is actually paused for 10 frames. When checking a dash, reacting to the dash implies that we see the dash first, then attack afterwards. If we manage to react so fast that we press a button during the screen freeze, after which they have 8 frames of startup. When we consider that drive rush jab is one of Ken's best options for approaching a neutral, we can see that this would take an extra 4 frames after the 8 frame startup, a 12 frame approach. Let's assume that at that spacing, we try to beat their jab with our long range space control poke, such as the ones we've examined before. Cammy's standing heavy kick sits at 11 frames, while Ken's sits at 12 and Chun's at 13. During my testing, the frame counters seem to indicate that drive rush is allowed to act 1 frame faster, causing it to trade with 11 frame Cammy poke, but also beating Ken's and Chun's. In order to make Cammy's poke win, I had to buffer it before the drive rush even starts. This is something that requires further investigation, but there are already some conclusions that we can draw. For characters with pokes frames 13 or slower, you simply cannot use it to counter Ken's drive rush jab, even if the spacing is correct and you know exactly when he will do that. For instance, Manon's 15 frame standing heavy kick can be clipped by drive rush jab even if you attack before he starts to drive rush. If you happen to be pressing a long range poke during the freeze frame as part of playing neutral, you may simply lose to drive rush. This freeze frame, while likely intended to add extra time for a player to check this option, has the unintended effect of freezing the defender in place, preventing them from escaping during the flash or attacking with a longer poke. Once again, the Street Fighter 6 system is so interlinked that removing this freeze frame would have ripple effects, where it would ultimately break all combos that rely on drive rush and their corresponding Oki setups. As it stands, in order to check drive rush, your character cannot rely on a strong, longer poke to preemptively stuff the option, unless you input it well before they even begin to drive rush or are drive rushing from full screen. Because that player can just choose advantageous hurt boxes to drive rush with, small but fast jabs would also get crushed. For characters with the privilege of having a poke that is disjointed, such as a crouching medium punch, you can try to check this drive rush on reaction. In response, an offensive player can stop their drive rush early and whiff punish your poke, choosing a button with a better hurt box that may outrange your crouching medium punch altogether, or just sway to avoid it. When we take a look at Footsies in our Footsies Triangle earlier, we can see that this is an approach option that fares well against pokes, especially given that you are only on counter hit and not punish countered on such a great starter. Small pokes should not discourage you. When we investigate how this alters the RPS of the triangle, we're able to see that since drive rush approach would inherently beat whiff punishing, but also wins or goes even with pokes, the only real option is to approach yourself and hope that faster rock beats rock. Given the special properties and sheer speed of dry rush, it is an option that consistently threatens and works on even the best players in the world, much less everyone else. Playing defensively against this option can often take our entire mental stack, thus taking away from the rest of our focus, and even then, a variation of a drive rush option can interact with our check in an unexpected way. In order to minimize our mental stack usage, we could simply decide to let them in for free instead of trying to stop them, or play extremely preemptively if our character has the tools to do so, or to drive rush ourselves to beat them to the punch. That also puts the burden of the mental stack on them. In history, drive rush is far from the only fast approach option in Street Fighter, even by the frame data. Dashes in Third Strike are across the board extremely fast, but most famous of which is Makoto's, which sits at an absurd 11 frames, basically the duration of the freeze frame itself. This dash is a defining characteristic of Makoto that separates her from any other character in Street Fighter. Checking this option in terms of reactions alone is not particularly reasonable, especially given the input delay, much like it's not always reasonable for drive rush. Unlike drive rush, if the Makoto only threatens dashing, we can try to check it without fear. We are allowed, by the design of the game, to preemptively press buttons placed where they would dash into. Because the dash comes first and then their button afterwards, they do not slide in with a favorable hurtbox to stuff our own dash check. This would allow us to use faster, shorter range buttons to check dashes. These fast buttons also tend to have low whiff recovery, allowing us to be able to place them at strong timings to stop dashing in order to cover that option and then still be able to recover and microspace. Rather than dash checking being the end of the matchup, Makoto plays around this option by using other pokes and properties of her buttons, as well as her unique movement in her own methods of footsies. The threat of her dash and the resulting counter options become the start of the conversation rather than its end. When we take a look at games that were inspired by the Street Fighter series, one recent example is Grand Blue Fantasy Versus and Rising. For example, Rising was created as a sequel to Versus with plenty of added system mechanics, such as a guard-crushing tool that can be countered by the same system, a confirm tool, and an alpha counter that all share the same resource, as well as a fast approach tool. These options mirror Street Fighter 6's system mechanics. 6XL in some ways is an alternative take on Drive Rush. Because of the dash macro, we can dash in 1 frame, with the following 6XL attack taking 9 frames of startup, equating to an effective 10 frame plus approach option. With its great range and speed, this is an option that is better than frame-perfect staggers, as well as serving as a fantastic barre option, turning minus scenarios that are close enough into an exchange of turns. When speaking with a top Grand Blue player, they told me that the only real ways of dealing with 6XL are to magically hope that they whiff the 6XL if you're walking backwards or the follow-up, or to gamble with 2M. Good luck! At the very least, through patches in Rising's history, 6XL experienced increased pushback, preventing point-blank tick-throw scenarios as we'd outlined before, as well as lowering its ability to stick onto the opponent. Additionally, its scaling was increased. This makes it less efficient to use meter to increase the reward off of 6XL, incentivizing you to stick to low-cost options, drastically reducing the tool's damage output. This change in risk-reward balances the option greatly as opposed to Drive Rush, which instead buffs the normal and increases the reward compared to other options. However, its ability to still allow for players to outperform a frame-perfect stagger is something that changes the skill ceiling of the game compared to previous versions. This allows you to be able to autopilot your offense, similar to manners in which we've spoken about before. In addition to being able to be used in neutral, Drive Rush can also be used to follow a slow traveling fireball. In past versions of Street Fighter, this could be seen as an option that Jury has, as well as a tool that mimics Akuma's Red Fireball, V Trigger Cancel, and even Fireball Wire C, an option that was pretty infamous in Exerd. This allows for characters to set up their fireball essentially as a shield for them to approach with, where a button check just won't work at all. As part of the power budget for some characters, Guile is incentivized to use L Sonic Boom or Enhanced L Boom to approach, since he can no longer chip with fireballs based off of the system. Rather than focusing purely on space control, Guile would be incentivized to engage with the drive system. In some ways, this makes the matchup more dynamic, but also plays into general trends of Anime-ification. In matchups where a character already struggles against fireballs, such as Manon, she now also has minimal ways to stop a Guile from approaching outright with this fireball, and asserting pressure essentially whenever he wants. Through Fireball Drive Rush, even zoning characters rush down. In addition, where Raw Drive Rush incurs some level of risk as an approach tool, Drive Rush canceling off of a long-range poke such as Crouching Medium Kick carries limited risk. On hit, they can get their full confirm, and on block they can assert pressure. Both of these scenarios lead to similar pressure. In fact, if they didn't want to leave a gap after their Drive Rush, they can cancel into a jab. Just as a defender can skip returning to neutral and re-engage with Crouching Medium Kick Drive Rush, in Footsies, a player can turn a blocked normal into an incredibly favorable plus scenario. Looking at these tools to close the distance, such as 6XL, and the various forms of Drive Rush, we can notice that checking these options is weighted towards the player who is approaching. However, through general decrease in movement over time, we can find that players are also unable to avoid these aggressive tools as they had used to. We have illustrated that within Street Fighter 6, Drive Rush is too fast to avoid, and in fact it freezes the screen to prevent that anyways. In other series more known for fluid movement, the difference in movement over time is even more noticeable. For instance, a quick example would be Strive, where the characters also feel incredibly heavy, and have high block stun and low pushback. The screen is smaller, boxing characters in and pulling them together. You can compare this very quickly to games that are previous in the series like Xrd and Plus R. DNF Duel is also a world of difference when compared to MVC3, a previous 8ing title. Even in games like Tekken, and I'm less well versed in 3D titles, I've heard a lot of discussion around the differences between backdashing or sidestepping in the versions, and how they make it harder to avoid and weave around specific attacks. As for how those games are currently leaned towards the offensive player, I can really just say the words heat system and then leave it at that. With many offensive tools throughout many modern fighting games in general just having increased range, it becomes more or less impossible to avoid the other player, and also inevitable that they will start their pressure. Playing neutral purely to avoid these options is not favored. You will need to play through. Just as offense and defense have evolved with changing trends over time, we can see that offense-oriented design has also entered the space of neutral. New tools, as well as the design of neutral and the movement of characters, altogether are meant to minimize periods of footsies. Defensive play has become inherently vulnerable, where the best form of defense is to strike before the other player does. These prevent a player from being able to control neutral and defend their space against overwhelming offensive tools, and increases the volatility in neutral, which loop back into those guess-heavy pressure sequences. Throughout our discussion of game design, we have taken a deeper dive into the specific interactions that occur and how these pieces fit together. When we take a look at system mechanics and the system as a whole, I want to state that we have been examining these fighting game systems not just as their outward-facing mechanics such as meters, but as the sum of all of the mechanics that undergird the interactions of a game and the design philosophies that they reflect. Street Fighter 6 demonstrates this exceptionally as a unified structure where the drive system, to the pushback, the frame data, and the function of all of the buttons are interlinked. In examining the system of the game, we have examined all of its pieces. Taking all of these individual pieces, we were able to draw conclusions on the overall direction that defense, offense, and neutral have taken. For instance, offensive play results in frame data heavy, knowledge-centric, risk-reward guesses. Defensive play, a mirror of offense, revolves around guessing on these enforced scenarios in order to turn the tides and then assert this same offense yourself. We can also see that neutral is heavily skewed towards minimizing the downtime without an advantage state, hurdling the characters towards each other. When we put all of these together, we can sum this up as modern fighting games encouraging forced aggression, where you run in as much as possible and guess as much as possible, with inherently volatile and inconsistent results. When taken more abstractly, we can treat system mechanics as an incentive system, much like a financial system. Some actions are rewarded more and some actions are rewarded less. Naturally, in order to win, a player will choose actions that are rewarded more. When the system rewards perverse behavior, it will happen. Examining the drive system through this lens, we also note very interestingly that characters are encouraged to drive rush to close this gap, costing meter. When these characters are close, their attacks will cause each other to further reduce this meter, leading to burnout. As the game pushes the characters close together, it simultaneously discourages overusing the meter too heavily, a contradiction that leads to unusual inactivity, either due to fear of burnout or just losing the round altogether from it. Therefore, just as the drive system encourages rushing in, It pushes character towards burnout, which can swing the momentum the other way, leading towards volatility. We can think of a game system as its language, and each individual mechanic as a word in this language. Without certain words, certain ideas cannot be expressed. Without throw protection, guard jump cannot exist. A limited language can lead to limited thought and intention. A limited system leads to limited styles and intentions. When a new player approaches the drive system, they are faced with a game that heavily rewards pressing buttons and running in over about everything else. In addition, they are unlikely to be able to check a drive rush at all, or struggle to deal with jump-ins with their mental stack full, random DIs. It's going to be tough. Rather than think and try to defend against these options, instead the system pushes them to just stop thinking altogether and mash. If we believe in tabula rasa, a player is essentially a clean, fresh slate, with no particular leaning one way or another, save for their own personal tendencies. A new player is as likely to want to play defensively as they may want to play aggressively. A player can value planning their options carefully and playing safely, as much as another may want to run in. At a lower level, especially with the design of the system mechanics, this patient player will be unable to learn how to play patiently. They'll face a wall of reaction tests and knowledge checks that beat even the best of players with the best of reactions. They have to play the way the game wants them to play. Vice versa, an aggressive player is rewarded for overwhelming other players through things like randomly drive rushing whenever possible. They may eventually hit a wall and have to learn other skills, if ever. As defined earlier, system mechanics are the inner workings and gears of a game's function that reflect general design goals and outcomes. However, when we play Street Fighter VI, ideally, we didn't aim to play the drive system, but to play as Ryu, Ken, Dhalsim, Guile, Gief, the list goes on. Where system mechanics may be more permissive instead of controlling, characters are allowed to express their own unique concepts and ideas within the larger framework of the system. For instance, a strong mechanic may interact with another character's kit, such that it can make some aspects smoother or enhance other features. Characters can be defined by their unique interplay within these certain mechanics. Within Grand Blue Rising, and I know I'm going to be going on a limb by talking about a character that's so new, but Versusia, who was recently released, has a unique dash momentum when compared with the rest of the cast. This prevents her 6XL from being the same as an overwhelming tool, but also enhances her other features, such as her 66H, and her other personal buttons and mechanics using her unique dash momentum, expressing a new concept within Rising. And quickly to bring back Ken for Third Strike, even a tool as simple as an LDP can gain an interesting wrinkle because of the parry system. If the Ken presses standing heavy punch, you'll be conditioning them to parry high, but he can coincidentally also OS by inputting the DP late, such that on block, it won't come out, but if an opponent parries, he will hit their counterattack. This creates a new mind game and a whole load of possibilities for LDP that just couldn't exist in other games without that system. One possible goal for a system mechanic and a character mechanic is that the two exist as two different layers that mesh together. Because of this interweaving, an idea from a character plays with the ideas built into the system, gaining new layers and texture that are otherwise not possible. From the system mechanics, such as deep layers, and especially when we add characters into this mix, there should be a deep sense of gestalt, where the sum is more than pieces. Where system mechanics are more free and permissive, allowing characters to use and interact with it in their own ways, characters can choose how to play their own game within a game. For system mechanics that are a bit more widespread and have similar functionality across the cast, do these systems instead inherently homogenize a character? For other system-heavy games like Third Strike, you could argue that all the characters at least have to interact with the parry system, especially on Oki. For KOF, where all the characters will chase that hop-based neutral, Is it possible to say that there is more similarity between Athena and King of Dinosaurs than there is between Guile and Zangief? This generalized form of this question deserves to be brought up, though it can't yet be answered within the scope of this video. When looking at Street Fighter 6's drive system, we can notice that executing one action inherently leads to the exclusion of another interaction. Though this is not fundamentally solely on Street Fighter 6, just as a quality of games in general, just as an example, when a player drive rushes, they are not blocking, and they are not poking. Adding drive rush into a game therefore reduces how often a player chooses those other options, and may inherently replace other options such as dashing. Given this characteristic of replacement, do strong system mechanics replace unique qualities from a character? On a more philosophical level, is there a fundamental limit to the amount of qualities that can be expressed at once? In writing the script for this video, I came up with that question randomly and asked a friend of mine for his thoughts. I was amazed at the response that I received almost immediately. Since we can say that all of philosophy is a fighting game, I will do my best to translate that answer back into my own language. In a practical level, whether there is a fundamental limit to the amount of qualities that can be expressed as once doesn't really matter too much. A person can only experience and perceive so many qualities. When we take a look specifically at the drive rush example, even if it filled the defender's entire mental stack, and they were staring at it, and they knew exactly when they would drive rush, there is still a chance that they would mess up, which is kind of a reaction test, as opposed to layer mix. Therefore, the answer that my friend stated is that the mental stack is that practical limit to the amount of qualities and layers that a player or person can express or understand in an interaction or an instance at a fighting game. Simply, because drive rush is a quality that fills the entire mental stack by itself, it is something that linearizes the amount of qualities that a person experiences. Games with more varied options and mental stack lead to a greater amount of ideas expressed, even if they do not happen at the same time, and that the OSs also allow with a player to alter and interact with these options. It allows them to block their mental stack or choose and select options as they please, allowing them to fit in more layers, and that is richness. We can then define a rich interaction as an option that relies on a greater amount of layers or varieties in qualities, and a shallow interaction as one that plays to less complex decision making. Taking the example of a drive rush, a player who drive rushes all the time because the other player simply cannot react at all is in fact making a smart choice that solves the other player, but the resulting interaction is shallow. Let's say that a player drive rushes after threatening a fireball zoner with a jump in. The opponent hesitates, giving them less time to react. Then, the offensive player chooses to throw because he estimates that the opponent cannot check with a button, and will therefore choose to parry or block. This is making a complex decision, which creates a richer interaction. Rich interactions show a complexity and depth in design. In a deep game, the options available to the player through the system and their character can be used to create varied and emergent behavior. Ultimately, these decisions for Street Fighter 6 were done with the intent of making a game that was more accessible to new players, and to have them enjoy the genre themselves. This is an admirable goal in a vacuum, though as we have shown throughout this video, the particular decisions that modern designers have made are actually counterproductive. First, leniency in offensive execution lead to easier to create offensive situations. The situations themselves are made frame tight because of the large input buffers, forcing the player to know that situation in order to be able to stand a chance. Of course, by design, these situations must still be real enough that even the best players in the world must still more or less guess. Even after blocking that initial pressure, characters are kept closer together rather than returning to neutral, and are incentivized to reassert pressure, once again working with rigid frame rules. Neutral, which is more intuitive than knowledge-based pressure, is greatly de-emphasized, with defensive play unfavored altogether. This boxes new players into playing with forced aggression and guessing with high-powered nukes over intentionality. The inherent randomness of these games then provide poor feedback to players for what was a good decision or a bad one, where they may instead just keep repeating things to play the odds. For veteran players, these effects are even more notable. Modern game designs are inherently designed to limit the skill ceiling of fighting games, to flatten that skill curve. For example, low execution ceiling caps how hard routes or confirms can get, streamlining players of all skills into predetermined routes. There becomes little player expression and differentiation in preference and executional habits. What is left is a limited set of repetitive, canned interactions that were tuned exactly to the aims of the designer, to randomize the games and to flatten the skill curve. These high-variance games inherently make matches less satisfying to play, as the randomness leads to less clear relationships between skill and wins, giving players less control over their individual results. This can be seen as one of the main factors that players at the highest level struggle to achieve relative consistency. In short, we can see that this paradigm for fighting games has neither helped new players to the degree that they were intended, while also alienating many veteran players. Rather than creating a discussion centered around which game is best or who to aim fighting games towards, I would encourage that other people also begin diving into these systems to ask their own questions and find their own answers. As each fighting game is a reaction to the previous, in learning and discussing these topics, I hope that we can build a better path forward. I encourage players to try all sorts of games, whether they are old games or weird games, to find unique takes to fighting games and learn something new. I encourage players to discuss these concepts more open-mindedly and with more detail, so that together we can discover new things in fighting games and push the genre forward. Thank you very much. If you've made it all the way through the video and reached this point, then thank you so much. In making this video, one of my primary concerns was expressing my thoughts, which are shared by many veteran players about the state of fighting games, and the trends in which their designs have shown. If it's not clear already, I love fighting games, and you really don't have to make a several-hour video on something that you don't feel strongly for. In order to make my point clear to players who may not understand my perspective, or have much background knowledge in fighting games at all, I felt that I had to be as thorough as possible in examining every detail, mind game, and outcome of these interactions. Given its inherent length, I also aimed to make this format closer to a video essay and to make it as easy to listen to as possible. Granted, okay, it was a first try, I had to learn most of this on the fly, but anyways, I really hope that people are able to take these arguments seriously, and once again, thank you so much.